What's up, ladies and gentlemen? Omni-sensei here with What If I Were Reborn in Mushoku Tensei as a Beast Monarch? Part 4. If you enjoy this type of content, please smash that like button. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Don't forget to check out the original story linked in the description. Let's dive into the rise of a Beast Monarch without further ado. The Blue Dragon Range rose imposingly against the horizon, a vast mountain chain that seemed to touch the heavens. Its jagged peaks were dusted with snow, while the lower slopes displayed dense forests and hidden valleys. Strong winds howled between the cliffs, carrying the echo of distant roars, a reminder to all who dared challenge this domain that the wildlife here was ruled by colossal winged creatures. The rising sun bathed the mountains in a golden hue, creating a striking contrast between the soft gleam of the snow and the deep shadows of the rocky formations. Leaping nimbly between the mountains, a young beast boy navigated the terrain with remarkable agility. His silver hair reflected the glow of the rising sun, while his dark skin seemed to absorb the light, accentuating his golden eyes, which shimmered with intensity. This was Rigor, moving with the grace of a predator intimately familiar with his surroundings. After obtaining a small map from the dwarf Brightstone, he had not hesitated. Determined, he immediately set out for the range. Fortwind had wanted to accompany him, but Rigor declined. "Go to Godbard and inform him that I'll work with Brightstone to improve my sword," he ordered before heading off alone. Now, standing on a high peak, Rigor observed the path he had traveled. The mountains stretched in every direction, imposing and majestic, as the wind whipped against his body, bringing a sense of renewal. He took a deep breath, feeling the cold, rarefied air fill his lungs. In the distance, the sun slowly rose, painting the world in shades of orange and gold. It was as if the universe conspired to make this moment unforgettable. The roars of dragons echoed far off, mingled with the occasional sounds of other monsters that inhabited the region. It was a wild symphony, a constant reminder of the dangers that surrounded this place. Yet, Rigor felt an inexplicable sense of freedom. He thought about his previous world. He had surpassed by leagues anything a human from his old life believed possible, and even what most of his tribe in this world could achieve. That feeling was refreshing, a testament to his growth and how he had embraced the world he now called home. He scanned the surroundings once more, absorbing the view. The mountain range extended as far as his eyes could see, with green forests in the distance and valleys hidden among the peaks. From that vantage point, he could even glimpse the edges of the great forest, a green mantle stretching to the horizon. His sharp senses caught every detail, the subtle sound of leaves in the distance, the fresh scent of vegetation mingled with the mineral aroma of the rocks. It was as if all of nature presented itself to him. After a few moments of contemplation, he took a deep breath and resumed his journey. There was something about the mountain range that captivated him. As he ran, leaping from rock to rock, he thought that he might return here in the future, just to explore and once again enjoy this unique environment. As he approached the point marked on the map, Rigor realized he no longer needed it. There was only one cave in the vicinity. From within, he could hear deep, steady breathing, and a slight shiver ran down his spine, a primal sense of danger. This was the place. He took out the black cloak Brightstone had given him and put it on. Immediately, he felt his own scent disappear. With his keen sense of smell, he could barely detect any trace of his own presence. Next, he donned the triangular-shaped necklace around his neck. As soon as he did, the sound around him vanished. The absence of noise was disconcerting, but also effective. Once again, he marveled at the quality and potential of magical items. Even with my senses, I can barely perceive my own presence. These items are incredible, he thought. The usefulness of these tools reinforced his ideas about the value magical items could hold in this world. It was something he could not afford to ignore. With that in mind, Rigor unsheathed Tsukikage, the gift from his master, which reflected the faint light within the cave. His steps were silent as he moved deeper into the darkness. The dragon's breathing grew louder with each step, and the tension in the air heightened. The air inside the cave was dense, steeped in a darkness that seemed to swallow all light. The walls, uneven and covered with patches of phosphorescent moss, gave the space a macabre atmosphere. The ground, littered with sharp stones and fragments of bones, crunched under Rigger's deliberate steps. The acrid, metallic scent of old blood lingered in the air, mingling with the moisture dripping rhythmically from stalactites overhead. The sound was muffled, almost non-existent, but Rigger could feel the immense presence ahead before even seeing it. There, in the heart of the cave, lying atop a massive rock surrounded by bones, was the white-eyed blue dragon. Its sleek, aerodynamic body defied the stereotype of a cumbersome creature. It measured about 40 to 50 meters in length, with scales that gleamed under the faint light, appearing as though carved from sapphire. Its triangular head, adorned with spikes, held enormous wide-open eyes that stared unblinkingly at the cave entrance. The bones around it told grim tales. Crushed dwarf skulls and shattered beast ribs lay scattered amidst a bluish mist that slowly escaped the dragon's nostrils, drifting through the air. Rigger held his breath for a moment, his heart pounding. The dragon's eyes were open and fixed, as if watching him directly, but the creature's rhythmic breathing revealed it was asleep. It was strange and unnerving, but it made sense. The dragon was blind. Even so, its other senses were undoubtedly sharp. This was an S-rank beast, a mutant among its kind, with exceptional strength and speed. Few had survived encounters with it, and most accounts claimed no weapon could pierce its scales. Rigger was confident in his speed and strength, but certainly didn't want to test them against a mutant S-rank monster. Rigger knew he had to be swift and decisive, otherwise, the battle would drag on. He didn't underestimate the creature, but neither could he retreat. His strategy was clear: kill it before the dragon became aware of his presence. He prepared Tsukikage, the blue sword resembling the dragon's scales, and assumed an Iato stance, channeling magic into the blade. Streaks of lightning coiled around the sword, illuminating Rigger's determined face in the dim light. Fire wouldn't be as effective against a dragon, but electricity was another matter. Though his control over lightning was still limited and not something he would typically use in combat, this ambush scenario was different. He knew a well-placed strike could make all the difference. The dragon still hadn't noticed him, a testament to the effectiveness of the items. It couldn't see, hear, or smell him now. With lightning crackling around the blade, Rigger took a step back, charging his burst step to maximum power. He cast a physical barrier spell infused with a significant amount of mana at the cave entrance to prevent the dragon from escaping. Brightstone had mentioned that the creature possessed above-average intelligence for dragons, and Rigger wasn't about to underestimate that information. Everything was ready. With a single thought, he surged forward, becoming a blur of speed as he executed his most familiar technique, the longsword of light. The sword sliced through the air with blinding speed, aiming straight for the dragon's neck. But before it could strike its target, Rigger noticed a contraction in the creature's neck muscles. The dragon suddenly reared back, throwing its body with surprising agility and mobility. Its movement was almost graceful, confirming the dwarves' warnings. It was incredibly fast for something of its size. As it retreated, the dragon let out a low guttural roar, but Rigger was already on the move. It sensed the movement of the air. Rigger thought, shocked. Even so, his strike wouldn't be stopped so easily. The dragon had only moved slightly back when Rigger closed the gap. The lightning-wreathed blade slashed toward the dragon's neck. The cut was visceral. Tsukikage grew sharper and sturdier the hotter it became, and the lightning provided supreme heat, capable of reaching extraordinary temperatures. The blue blade was honed to its maximum, but Rigger still felt resistance as it cut through the dragon's scales, as if they were made of an exceptionally tough mineral. However, the lightning around the sword and his immense physical strength helped him break through the defenses, slicing halfway into the dragon's neck, leaving a trail of blood staining the surrounding rocks. The dragon recoiled again, unleashing a deafening roar. Blood gushed from the wound, mixing with a blue mist emanating from its nostrils. The pain seemed to ignite the dragon's fury, causing it to thrash wildly, but every movement only worsened the injury. Rigger took a slight step back, his senses on high alert. The battle was nearing its end. He had gravely wounded the monster, and fighting in this condition would be extremely disadvantageous for it. Now, he needed to prepare for a decisive final strike. He began analyzing the dragon's next move and quickly formulated an idea. The cavern fell into an almost absolute silence, broken only by the occasional sound of small stones shifting, silent witnesses to a battle yet to unfold. The blue dragon, an imposing creature about 50 meters long, moved nimbly through the space, as if fearing to stay still and become a target. Its lean but powerful frame betrayed its mutant origin. The wound on its neck continued to bleed, thick drops mixing with the dust and bones scattered across the ground. The fine mist from its nostrils enveloped the area, making the air heavy and oppressive. Despite its impressive vitality, the dragon was already showing signs of fatigue. Its dull eyes scanned the cavern in a desperate attempt to locate Rigor. But the beast boy was entirely camouflaged, his magical items masking any sound or scent that could betray him. Even if the dragon were to look straight at him, it wouldn't see him. Rigor remained motionless, focusing his magic on a stone cannon aimed at the dragon's likely location. Carefully manipulating its composition, he transformed it into an extremely resilient metal. Every second was precious, and Rigor used the time to prepare an explosive strike. When the blue dragon, unable to detect its opponent, attempted to release its signature flames to ignite the entire cavern, its body betrayed it. The wound on its neck caused it to choke on the flames, which escaped through the exposed gash, delivering excruciating pain. A groan of agony echoed through the cavern, but its vitality kept it standing though unsteady. Instincts warned the dragon of imminent danger. Fleeing was the only sensible choice. In a single fluid motion, the dragon dashed toward the cavern's entrance, its scales scraping against the rocks as it moved with surprising agility for its size. However, as it reached the entrance, its skull collided violently with an invisible barrier, and the impact reverberated throughout the space. A significant crack formed in the barrier, but it wasn't enough to break it. Before the dragon could react, Rigor seized the moment of confusion. The stone cannon, now dark as obsidian, fired with relentless force and precision. The creature, though unstable, tried to dodge by jerking its head to the side, but it wasn't enough. The stone cannon pierced through the dragon's neck near the previous wound, completing what the initial strike had started. The dragon's head was severed from its body, which convulsed in involuntary spasms. Blood flowed in rivers across the cavern floor as silence fell once more, interrupted only by the dripping of vital liquid. Rigor stood beside the imposing corpse, observing the result of his strategy. Reflecting, he thought, information and preparation truly are dangerous weapons. If I had encountered this dragon in the middle of the mountains, it would be hard to say who would win. Its strength, speed, the resilience of its scales, and its ability to fly would make it an incredibly dangerous opponent. Still, he believed he would have a chance, though the confrontation would be far riskier. This realization underscored the importance of always being prepared. Today he was the hunter, but if he could exploit the abilities and weaknesses of this dragon, others could surely do the same to him. He had witnessed firsthand how easily an enemy could be ambushed if their skills were known and natural counters were available. From now on, he decided to keep some of his abilities hidden as trump cards. At the same time, he acknowledged a hint of arrogance, even if unconscious, in his actions. This realization came despite constant reminders to himself and warnings from others. Turning to the corpse, Rigor resolved to make full use of the dragon's resources. Activating his magic eye, he searched for the blue dragon's magic stone. Once he found it, he carefully retrieved it, aware of its immense value. He wouldn't leave the precious scales behind either and planned to take the entire creature back with him. First, though, he crouched and placed a hand on the ground, closing his eyes to focus. Utilizing his heightened sense of hearing and earth sensitivity, he searched for other blue dragons or subterranean activity. This ability, honed after learning the king-level magic Earth Fissure from his master, proved invaluable. Gradually, he detected distant movement, kilometers away. Faint sounds of impact and struggle echoed through the underground. He frowned, pondering. Perhaps the blue dragons are simply fighting each other, he thought. He planned to hunt more dragons. His visits to this area would be rare, and dragon materials were both precious and scarce. He also had his mission from the Adventurers Guild and certainly wouldn't use the mutant dragon scales to complete it. Concluding his investigation, Rigor created an improvised stone box and used ice magic to preserve the dragon's meat. Perhaps it would yield an exceptional feast. After all, he had never tasted dragon meat before. With everything prepared, he turned toward the sounds of battle, determined to hunt more dragons. Rigor moved swiftly through the mountains, ready for any ambush. his figure barely discernible due to his speed as he followed the sounds of battle. As he approached, the smell of blood, scorched rocks and dragons, many dragons, grew stronger. His master had taught him that all dragon species lived in groups. Now, seeing it firsthand, he realized she hadn't been exaggerating when she said she hadn't met a single person who returned alive after venturing into a dragon's lair. And he hadn't even truly entered the blue dragon's territory yet. He was only on the outskirts. His master had described their true territory as being filled with dragons everywhere. He wouldn't venture there today, but he had plans to do so in the future. Secretly, he harbored a dream of taming a dragon. After all, what man hadn't dreamed of riding a dragon? As he drew closer, the echoing roars gave way to the metallic clash of steel against scales. Confusion settled over him. It wasn't just dragons fighting. There was steel? How? Each step brought him nearer to the source of the conflict, but also heightened his sense of confusion and caution. His brow furrowed, his senses on high alert. The sound of weapons was unexpected. Who could possibly be fighting dragons in such a dangerous place? This could be a trap, Rigger thought, his gaze sharp as a predator's, assessing the terrain. The name of the human god echoed in his mind as a constant warning. His instincts were tingling with danger, though it wasn't as intense as when he'd first met Hidegami. He remained wary of him because of that encounter, but nothing was going as wrong as he'd expected. Slowly, he began to consider the possibility that he might be mistaken. Rigger had already decided not to bring Skull with him, a calculated precaution to avoid unnecessary complications. If things went awry, he wanted the freedom to retreat without having to protect or abandon his wolf companion, whom he had grown fond of. As he got closer, new information reached his senses. A new scent. A dense, pervasive odor of dragons. Many of them hung heavy in the air. But there was something more. He sniffed again, this time focusing. Intertwined with the sulfuric stench of dragons was something familiar. A scent he would recognize anywhere. It was someone of the beast race. Rigger's heart quickened, and his thoughts raced. Someone of his own kind was in that cave. And from the sound of clashing steel and dragon roars, that person was fighting. Clicking his tongue in frustration, he muttered, "A beast race member. But who? And why?" A wave of sulfur hit his nose, and he instantly knew the dragons had used fire in the battle. The smell of nearly solidified molten earth indicated the fire had been unleashed hours ago, suggesting this battle had been raging for quite some time. This only heightened his caution. Even for an experienced warrior, fighting in an enclosed space against high-level dragons was a recipe for disaster. Whoever was inside had to be incredibly strong to endure this long. Rigger stopped at the cave's entrance. Strangely, there were no blue dragons guarding it. The gaping opening in the mountain was large enough to accommodate massive dragons, yet the darkness inside was oppressive, as though the mountain itself sought to swallow anyone who dared approach. His frown deepened, his thoughts racing. Could this be any more obvious? This feels like a perfectly laid trap. He knew his strength, but he was also aware of his stamina's limits. If he were surrounded by A and S-rank dragons in a confined space, it would be the end of him. Crossing his arms, he tapped his fingers against his forearm. Should I just turn back and pretend I didn't see anything? The thought deeply unsettled him. He was starting to wonder if he was being overly paranoid about a god who might have little to no power over him. Then he sniffed again. Beyond the scent of the beast race member and the dragons, there was another distinct scent. Fainter, but unmistakable, a human. His eyes narrowed. This made things even more complicated. Who could this human be? An ally? An opponent? Or just another pawn caught in the chaos? Rigger deliberated. His instincts were usually right, and he didn't sense an overwhelming threat as long as he avoided going deep into the cave. Yet prudence urged caution. Still, the thought that they might simply be random victims lingered in his mind. That didn't obligate him to save them, of course, but he felt compelled to try. Finally, he let out a deep sigh, making his decision. I'll assess the situation. If it's within my capability, I'll save them. If it's too dangerous, well, too bad. Despite his rational words, a latent determination burned in his eyes. But he wasn't a fool. I'm definitely not entering that cave. With that resolve, Rigger took a step back, leaped into the air, and began circling the mountain. He would use some unconventional methods to ensure his escape route. His senses were at their peak, registering every sound and scent with sharp precision. Rigger skirted the mountain, keeping to higher ground where he could hear the sounds of battle and feel the vibrations in the earth below through his magic. Once again, he wondered how these fighters had ended up here. This far into the cave system, it was likely crawling with dragons. Pausing to reflect, a sly grin spread across his lips. Some might ask how he could save anyone when dozens of meters of rock and stone separated him from his target. The mountain walls were thick and sturdy, but he had spent years studying magic, learning to use it in every conceivable way. Why enter through the cave's door, when I can just create a new one? Gathering his mana, he focused intensely. Placing his hands on the ground, he felt the earth stretching out over several kilometers. The more he connected with the geological structure, the clearer his plan became. Slowly, the ground began to tremble. A faint yellow glow emanated from the soil beneath his feet, and the mountain itself seemed to respond to his command. Rigger thought to himself, I could create a smaller hole if I had more time, but using Earth Fissure as a base gives me a faster way to do this. Plus, a small hole would restrict my movement. I need to be extremely careful not to cause a collapse inside. With my current level of earth control, this spell should work. While continuing to sense the underground movements, he realized the battle inside the cave seemed to have ceased due to the tremors. The two combatants were running, perhaps trying to escape. After a few more seconds of intense concentration, Rigger finally thought, this is it. The structure is ready. Now I just need to put it into action. I hope it works. Determined, he slightly lifted himself off the ground, using wind magic to float. Flying skillfully and at high speed like a dragon was still a challenge for him, but floating was a simple task. While reflecting on how to name his spell, he heard dozens of roars coming from within the mountain. That sound echoed in his mind like a warning, but it also brought an epiphany as he observed the mountain from above. I've got it, he thought with a spark of satisfaction. Raising his hands, he shouted, Mountain Divider. Afterward, he amusingly thought he looked like Pain when he destroyed Konoha. At the command of his mana, the mountain seemed to respond as if it were alive. The rocks and walls began to turn malleable, moving like clay molded by a giant sculptor. In a motion reminiscent of an earthquake, the mountain began to open. But unlike a natural disaster like Earth Fissure, this process was more orderly, a symphony of control and power. Every stone, every rock moved precisely, creating a path before Rigger as if he were parting the sea. The surrounding mountains and ridges trembled in response. Birds and smaller animals fled the source of the tremor, while the roars of blue dragons in the mountain's heart grew louder. Some dragons had already started heading toward the exit, frightened by the noise and disturbance. The scene was breathtaking, and Rigger, floating above the ever-expanding opening, prepared himself to face whatever lay ahead. As the mountain began to open before Rigger, the scene emerging from within was, at the very least, unexpected. Amid the dust, rocks, dragons, and roars, he saw two figures. The first was a tall woman, about 1.85 meters, wearing minimal clothing in the traditional style of the beast race. Her long silver hair and ears contrasted with her dark skin, and her eyes, one red and the other green, shone with fierce intensity. She carried a red sword in one hand, while the other firmly held the hand of a child. The girl, with vibrant red hair, looked around 9 or 10 years old and struggled to keep up with the warrior's pace. Despite this, she made no complaints. Both were injured. Scratches of various sizes, bruises, and burns were scattered across their bodies, but the beast woman's injuries were far more severe, with a deep gash across her back shaped like long claws. Rigger observed the situation with a mix of urgency and caution. The two were running toward a formation of taller rocks, seemingly trying to leap toward the opening he had created in the mountain's ceiling. Quickly, he assessed the dangers using his senses and his magic eye. Despite the presence of several blue dragons, his instincts detected no traps. Floating slowly into the cavern, he concentrated magic in his hand. Targeting a blue dragon about 60 meters long that was pursuing the two, it was almost upon them, and he needed a quick high-impact spell that wouldn't harm the pair. He declared aloud with theatrical confidence, "Lightning." He felt a bit embarrassed afterward, realizing he had thought about showing off in such an urgent situation. The magic in his hand burst into lightning that sliced through the air, striking the dragon almost instantly. The impact launched it a few meters away, leaving it paralyzed and halting its pursuit. The echoes of enraged dragon roars filled the cavern as others began turning their attention toward him. Wasting no time, Rigger manipulated the tall rocks around him, creating an improvised staircase to help the woman and the girl reach the top. There was no denying it. The beast woman was incredibly fast, evading most of the dragons trying to chase them. One dragon sprinted forward, flapping its wings for a short flight toward the pair. Anticipating the attack, Rigger moved slightly ahead and used his howling magic, releasing a powerful shockwave that spread through the cavern like a deafening roar. At the same time, he raised a physical barrier in front of himself. The dragon, slightly intimidated and stunned, lost some of its momentum. When it collided with the barrier, a crack formed but wasn't enough to break it. The dragon hesitated, retreating cautiously. Meanwhile, the beast warrior and the girl were almost at the end of the platform. Seeing they were about to escape, Rigger floated back through the opening in the ceiling. The woman, noticing the proximity of the exit, picked up the girl and leapt with all her strength out of the mountain. Inside the cavern, blue dragons began pursuing them. Rigger, however, was prepared. He cast a quick spell, creating a thin earthen barrier that temporarily covered the opening. It was easy to break through, but the dragons wouldn't know that. At least, he hoped they wouldn't. The earthen walls rose rapidly, blocking the dragons and muffling their furious roars. Rigger sighed in relief. These dragons were beasts, after all, so accustomed to always having a roof overhead that they assumed everything was back to normal when it reappeared. Outside, the warrior landed with the girl, both gasping for breath and on the brink of collapse. Rigger, reinforcing the rocks further, ran toward them. When he approached, he stopped 10 meters away, observing cautiously. The beast woman, exhausted and gravely injured, still held her red sword aloft, shielding the girl behind her. Her eyes could barely focus. The blood loss had pushed her to her limits, but her intent to protect the girl was clear and unwavering. Rigger raised his hands in a gesture of peace and calmly said, "It's all right. You're provisionally safe now." Surprisingly, as if his words were a signal to shut her down, the warrior's eyes rolled back, and she collapsed heavily onto the rocks. The girl screamed in despair, crouching beside her as tears streamed down her face. Amid sobs, she cried out, "Ghislaine!" And so, silence fell over the mountain as Rigger reflected on what he had just witnessed. POV, Ghislaine de Doldia. The explosion of light was all I saw before the world around me disappeared. Instinctively, my body reacted. I held Eris tightly, shielding her with my own body as the overwhelming energy enveloped us. My sharp hearing and keen senses were overloaded by a deafening sound, and for a moment, everything went blank. When I opened my eyes, the scenery was entirely different. We were in a gigantic cavern, so vast and dark that the ceiling seemed to merge with the horizon's shadow. The walls, hundreds of meters away, glimmered faintly as light reflected off sparse crystals, just enough to reveal the cavern's immensity. The ground was uneven, covered with sharp stones and massive claw marks. The air carried a metallic scent, mixed with something damp and putrid, as if this place had not seen sunlight for centuries. I carefully placed Eris on the ground. The young girl was stunned, looking around, unable to comprehend what had happened. "Stay close to me," I said firmly, drawing Hiramune. The sword gleamed faintly in the crystal's light, its blade reflecting the cold determination in my eyes. I tried to understand where we were. My trained senses, sharp as those of a beast, caught the oppressive silence around us. It felt as if the entire cavern was watching. A shiver ran down my spine. Suddenly, a heavy presence dominated the space. My gaze instinctively shifted to the top of a rock pile a few meters away. Two pairs of yellow eyes shone in the darkness, fixated on us. Pupils narrow like a serpent studied me with an intensity that made the hairs on my neck stand on end. Slowly, the creature emerged. Its massive silhouette became visible as it moved into the dim light. Its breath produced a faint, icy mist that dissipated into the air. Enormous teeth, shimmering blue scales like sapphires, and long membranous wings projected its dominance. It was a dragon. A blue dragon, at least 40 meters long, the apex predator of the entire world. I kept my expression serious and stoic, though my heart beat faster. This was no ordinary foe, and I knew it. I took only a moment to adjust my stance. Every fiber of my body, trained to the limit, was ready to kill. The dragon tilted its head slightly, its eyes evaluating the warrior before it. Its long, muscular tail moved slowly, dragging stones across the ground. But I didn't waste time. In the blink of an eye, without giving it a chance to react, I launched myself forward. My speed was devastating, impossible to track with the naked eye. Everything around me seemed to slow as I advanced with lethal precision. The dragon tried to retreat, realizing the danger too late. I slashed through the air with Hiramyun, its blade resonating with fierce brilliance as I executed the signature technique of the sword god style. When I stopped, I was already on the other side of the creature. The dragon remained motionless for a moment before its head flew off, crashing to the ground with a deafening thud, its eyes lifeless. The impact of my speed was so immense that stones were hurled into the air, and my hair rippled with the wind displacement. There was no hesitation in my movements. I spun on my heels and ran back to where Eris was without stopping to admire my work. Ghislaine. Where are we? Where's the mansion? Eris shouted, her voice filled with confusion. Her scream echoed and reverberated throughout the cavern. The scream was a prelude to something even more terrifying. Guided by my sharp senses, I sensed the danger before it materialized. Without hesitation, I didn't stop as I grabbed Eris by the collar and dragged her away, just moments before a colossal claw struck the spot where she had been standing. The ground trembled with the impact. A deep roar echoed through the cavern, so powerful it seemed to make the ground vibrate. I stopped on a higher rock and placed Eris behind me. My expression was serious but controlled. Young lady, do not leave my side under any circumstances and do not run off. We are in a very dangerous situation, I said, my voice firm but calm. It was an unquestionable order, and Eris, though scared, trusted me completely and would not disobey. Before I could plan my next move, more roars began to fill the cavern, each louder and closer than the last. The darkness was suddenly filled with dozens of golden eyes, all fixated on us. I tightened my grip around Hiramyun, preparing for battle. The smell of blood and burnt flesh lingered in a small section of the massive cavern, now littered with debris and steam rising from nearly molten stones. 4 blue dragon corpses lay on the ground. I had taken cover with Eris in a small alcove, a crack in the wall of the vast main cavern. The space was about 3 cubic meters, just enough for us to squeeze in and wait in silence. The dragons were far too large to fit through the narrow opening, but safety was far from guaranteed. Eris was lying on Ghislaine's lap. Her young body was marked with bruises and burns, signs of the battle they had faced. Ghislaine held the young girl firmly, but her heart weighed heavy with shame and guilt. She had fought with all her strength, yet Eris had been injured and had come close to death. Protecting a life amidst the chaos of a cave infested with blue dragons was an almost impossible task. Even as a sword king, Ghislaine thought that not even the sword god, her master, could protect someone in such a situation. Her serious expression reflected her frustration. Ghislaine knew she wasn't skilled in complex strategies or deep reflections. She didn't bother questioning where she was or why she was there. Her only priority at that moment was ensuring Eris's safety. Her strength lay in combat, but fighting against dozens of A and S-rank blue dragons while protecting someone was a challenge she had never faced before. Her body bore multiple wounds. Even so, giving up wasn't an option. Nor did she count on anyone coming to rescue her from a cave filled with dragons. "Young lady," she began, her voice calm yet firm, "I won't be able to carry you while fighting our way out. You'll have to run with me. I'll hold your hand." Eris opened her eyes, her gaze filled with confusion and fear. She had silently cried for a while when she thought Ghislaine wasn't looking. But upon hearing Ghislaine's words, a spark of hope ignited within her. Staggering, the young girl stood, barely able to keep her balance. I won't hold on to you. Ghislaine smiled faintly, a rare expression of pride on her face. Let's get out of here. They left the shelter, running quickly through the rocky formations, dodging dragons that roamed the area. Their small size helped them remain hidden for a time. But every step was a fight for survival. Ghislaine was swift and precise, slicing through the head of an approaching dragon with a devastating strike. Yet with every blow, she felt her strength waning. The dragons kept appearing, their roars as overwhelming as a shadow of death. As she fought, Ghislaine released Eris for a moment and advanced, leaping between rocks and cutting down a dragon with a lethal strike. She then returned to grab Eris and continued their escape. With every moment, it became increasingly evident they were surrounded, and the exit was still far away. After a long time, Ghislaine let go of Eris again to deal with an opponent in front of her. But another dragon targeted Eris. After defeating the dragon, Ghislaine rushed back to Eris, shielding her with her body. She felt the blue dragon's claws tear into her back as it roared and prepared a fiery breath. Ghislaine ignored the severe wound and hid with Eris behind a rock. She continued to fight as the dragons amassed due to the noise. She was losing a lot of blood and could feel the cave's exit was still far away. She prioritized fleeing, but the dragons kept coming in dozens. As her strength began to falter, a loud crash echoed through the cave. Ghislaine stopped, her sharp senses detecting a new danger. The dragons also paused, their watchful eyes turning to the ceiling. A massive opening began to form, with chunks of rock falling as if the world were collapsing. In this critical moment, Ghislaine didn't stop to question why it was happening. Her instincts screamed that this could be their only chance. She changed direction, running toward the highest rocks near the fissure with Eris. Her plan was clear: leap to the outside, even without certainty she could reach the exit. What she saw next, however, was something she would never forget. From within the opening in the ceiling, a young beastman descended, floating as if he were strolling. His silver hair shone under the light invading the cave, and his golden eyes calmly surveyed the environment as though he were merely passing by and decided to take a look. His aura was overwhelming, his manner immense, the greatest she had ever seen. It was visible to her magic eye. As the rocks moved to form the opening, she noticed with her magic eye that he was manipulating the stone with magic and seemed to be the one responsible for the fissure. Although genuinely surprised, Ghislaine didn't hesitate for a second. She kept running, ignoring the mysterious figure, focused on reaching the exit. The young man looked at them with interest and, in a seemingly casual gesture, raised his hand and said, "Lightning." A streak of blue lightning shot from his palm, striking a dragon that had been approaching from behind her. The dragon's roar of pain echoed through the cave, drawing the attention of the others and causing them to roar even louder and more ferociously. The cave trembled as he moved the earth, creating steps leading to the opening. It seemed he was helping them. She was still stunned by his use of magic, but continued onward. Even as he did this, a winged dragon charged at them. The young man advanced and used magic from the Doldia tribe. An ear-splitting roar erupted, a howling magic she had seen once before. Yet, as with everything else he did, this was on another level. The roar echoed through the cave, disrupting the cohesion of the dragon's unity. The dragon chasing them appeared to slam into an invisible wall created by the young man. A large crack formed, but the barrier held. Ghislaine ran as fast as she could, holding Eris's hand. Her body was injured, her muscles burning, but she couldn't stop. She weaved through paths clear of dragons, moving agilely over the rocky terrain. Finally, they reached the top. The boy had already floated out of the cave, and with a final leap, she gathered all her strength to cross the fissure. In midair, as she felt blood streaming from her wounds, she saw the boy blocking the dragons with more earth magic and approaching her. He seemed calm despite the chaotic situation. She raised Hiramyun, eyeing the young man. She felt no danger from him but had to be cautious. The blood loss was nearly making her unconscious, and she needed to ensure Eris was safe. He raised his hands and spoke in a reassuring voice, "You're safe for now." Those simple words dissolved her tension, and as she relaxed for a second, her body finally collapsed from the severe injuries. The red-haired girl knelt beside her, tears streaming down her face. "Ghislaine." POV, Rigor looked at the crying girl next to the warrior he realized was his relative, Ghislaine Didoldia. He doubted there could be two beast women as strong and skilled in the sword god style with the same name. It had to be her. He approached to heal her, but the red-haired girl, noticing his approach, grabbed Ghislaine's sword and pointed it at him. Her hand trembled slightly. "You there, do something to help her," she shouted, her tone commanding but nervous and desperate. Rigor raised an eyebrow and replied, "Is that how you ask for a favor from your savior?" She grew irritated for a moment but looked at Ghislaine, bleeding profusely, and spoke stammering, My grandfather has a lot of money. He can pay you." Rigor chuckled. If he played around much longer, Ghislaine's life would be at risk, and he wanted to leave the area quickly since the dragons could decide to break through the wall at any moment. "I don't want money. I have enough already. Don't worry, Ghislaine is from my tribe. I won't let her die like this." That seemed to lift Eris's spirits, and she quickly responded, "Then hurry." Rigor approached Ghislaine. Her wounds were severe, especially the one on her back, which had shredded several organs and deeply fractured bones. If it had been just a bit deeper, he wouldn't have been able to heal it even with advanced healing magic. He poured as much mana as possible into his healing spell, and after some time, he managed to close the wounds. Ghislaine was no longer in danger but was still exhausted and would need time to recover. Rigor then turned to the girl and grabbed her arm. She recoiled at first and asked, "What are you doing?" She almost punched him but hesitated, finally noticing he was using healing magic on her. After treating the girl's injuries, Rigor picked up Ghislaine in his arms. He looked at the warrior more closely this time. This woman is extraordinarily beautiful and attractive, he thought. I hadn't taken a proper look before, but she has all the right proportions in all the right places. Shaking off those thoughts, he addressed the girl. She needs time to recover. Follow me to a nearby cave. By the way, what's your name? The girl looked extremely nervous and worried, but eventually replied, Eris. My name is Eris Boreas Greyrat, she finally shouted. Rigor looked at her blankly and said, All right, Eris Boreas Greyrat, stop shouting. You're attracting dragons and beasts. Or I'll leave you in the middle of this mountain for the dragons to hunt. He said this and walked off without waiting for her reaction. The girl almost yelled, Wait, but lowered her voice at the last second. Rigor ran toward the mutant dragon's cave, carrying Ghislaine and with Eris tagging along. His pace was slow, as Eris couldn't keep up. Rigor helped by creating platforms of earth for her to cross the mountainous terrain more easily. Even so, she nearly shouted many times, growing impatient and asking about Ghislaine. However, a single glance from him reminded her of his threat to leave her behind. He quickly realized Eris was an extremely energetic and temperamental child with an incredibly strong personality. Even surrounded by dragons, the situation seemed to affect her only superficially, failing to traumatize her, or perhaps she processed trauma differently. He also noticed how much she cared for Ghislaine, which made him curious about their relationship. Was she her daughter? They looked nothing alike. Finally, they reached the mutant dragon's cave. Its scent still lingered, keeping other beasts from daring to approach, and Rigor intended to use this to his advantage. He fashioned a makeshift bed with soft sand and placed Ghislaine on it before turning his attention to Eris. He then stared at Eris, analyzing her until she lost her patience and shouted, What are you looking at? Rigor rubbed his temples, already irritated. Can you stop shouting? I hear perfectly well. I want to know what you two were doing inside a cave full of dragons. Eris seemed to think of the cave as a safe place. Perhaps that was why she felt somewhat at ease. Even so, she replied defiantly, as if to provoke him, I have no idea, she yelled, as though not knowing was some sort of achievement. She yelled even louder this time. Rigor narrowed his eyes, a thought crossing his mind. She reminded him of Linnea as a child, but Eris seemed like an even worse version, spoiled, extremely aggressive, and noisy. Fortunately, Linnea had learned some lessons to curb her behavior. Perhaps it was time to try something similar? Without a word, he moved in the blink of an eye. Accelerating instantly, Rigor grabbed Eris by her collar and carried her out of the cave to a cliffside. Before she could react, He held her by the leg and dangled her upside down. For a moment, she was stunned. But then she began screaming as she saw the height. Aya! Let me go! Ghislaine! Ghislaine! Help me! My grandfather won't let you get away with this. Rigger ignored her screams, keeping her suspended as she tried to grab his arm. She was dressed in training clothes, so he didn't worry about her discomfort in that position. Still emotionless, he said again, "Stop shouting." Then, he briefly let go of her leg before catching her again. The motion made Eris let out a terrified scream. Ghislaine! Ghislaine! Let me go! Rigger was surprised by her determination, even in such a situation. He decided to let her go completely. Eris screamed, her voice growing fainter as she fell. He watched for a few seconds before jumping after her. During the fall, Rigger created a stone platform to stop their descent. He caught Eris midair, cradling her like a princess. The girl was pale, clearly frightened this time. Rigger looked at her firmly and said, "Do you think I wouldn't dare let you go?" Not another scream. Without waiting for her response, he jumped back to the cave with fluid ease, landing gracefully and setting her down. Walking back inside, he remained silent. Eris, now mute, followed with a burning glare and a barely concealed murderous intent. Despite this, Rigger was impressed. The girl's strong and determined personality was remarkable. Any other child would have been utterly terrified after what she had been through. This was a point in her favor. She's even more stubborn than Linnea. Unfortunately, Rigger wasn't known for his patience with irrational children. Upon returning to the cave, he sat on a rock while Eris stood next to Ghislaine, still unconscious. He repeated his question, "How did you end up in there?" Eris hesitated but replied, less aggressively this time, "I really don't know. We were in the mansion, and then a white light appeared. And we ended up here." Rigger raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Mansion? Eris, right? Where are you from?" She replied aggressively but stopped herself from yelling at the last second. "What are you talking about?" "We're from Fitoa, obviously." Rigger was stunned and stood up abruptly. "Fitoa? You mean, in the kingdom of Azura?" Eris frowned, visibly confused by his reaction, and hesitated before answering, "Where else would it be?" Before Rigger could fully process what he had just heard, a movement nearby caught his attention. Ghislaine was starting to wake up, much earlier than he expected. He decided to wait for clearer answers from her directly. Eris watched Ghislaine with a worried expression as the warrior began to awaken. Her eyes opened slowly, and she tried to sit up quickly, but a muscle spasm sent a wave of intense pain through her body. Ghislaine gasped, forcing herself to support her weight with her hands. Her wounds were deep, and the pain was nearly unbearable. She turned her eyes toward Eris, ensuring she was safe. The young girl's calm appearance seemed to ease some of the tension in her body. Finally, Ghislaine looked at Rigger, who was sitting at a distance, silently observing her. "Hello," Rigger said with a light smile. Ghislaine reached for her waist, searching for her sword, but it was not there. Her eyes narrowed as she noticed the blade was missing. Rigger pointed toward a distant rock, where the sword rested. "Your sword is over there. But your injuries were severe. I recommend you rest a bit before moving again." Ghislaine sat up slowly, still feeling the pain, and looked around. The place was different from what she remembered, but she didn't feel rushed to understand her surroundings. She glanced at Eris once more before returning her attention to Rigger. Silence hung in the air for a moment until she finally spoke with unmistakable seriousness. "For saving us and keeping Eris safe until now, I owe you a debt. Thank you." Rigger looked slightly surprised, a shadow of confusion crossing his face. "Don't you want to know who I am? Or why I saved you?" Ghislaine remained impassive. "A debt is a debt, regardless of who you are or your motives. But yes, I'd need to know your name to repay it in the future. For now, my concern is ensuring Eris's safety and returning her to Lord Soros's mansion." Before she could finish, Eris interrupted anxiously. "Ghislaine, you need to teach him a lesson." Eris stopped mid-sentence. looking at Ghislaine's injuries, her worry growing. Ghislaine looked at her with an expression of doubt and confusion. Frustrated at not being able to seek revenge, Eris turned her gaze toward Rigger with an irritated, almost murderous look. Rigger, however, remained unperturbed and chuckled softly. The girl mentioned, "You're from Fitoa, on the Azura continent?" Ghislaine, still alert and vigilant, confirmed, "Yes, that's correct." Rigger let out a muffled laugh. "Well, this really is an impossible situation for you then. You're now on the other side of the world. This is the Blue Dragon Range, in Millis. I don't know how you ended up here, but the journey back might be a bit long." Ghislaine froze, her expression a mix of shock and apprehension. Eris beside her frowned, not fully understanding. "Is that far, Ghislaine?" she asked, her tone growing more concerned. Ghislaine remained silent for a moment, thoughtful, and whispered, "Indeed. Tallhand once told me the only home of the Blue Dragons was in the Blue Dragon Range, but I didn't think of it during the battle." She looked at Eris with a reassuring smile, trying to hide the worry in her eyes. "Young miss, don't worry. I will get you back home. However, the journey might take some time." Eris brightened at those words, smiling happily. But moments later she frowned, glared at Rigger, and with renewed determination, demanded, "What's your name? I won't forget what you did." Rigger chuckled softly, his eyes gleaming with a hint of humor. "Pleasure to meet you both. I'm Rigger Adoldia." After confirming Ghislaine was stable and Eris seemed fine, Rigger stood up and left the cave, saying he'd be back soon. The faint light outside revealed a sky filled with blue dragons flying in circles, roaring in evident irritation. He watched them for a moment, attentive, before descending the uneven terrain in search of twigs and firewood. When he returned, he carried what was needed to build a fire, ensuring the area remained secure. Inside the cave, Rigger stacked the wood, using fire magic to light the flames with precision. Then he opened a stone box, pulled out a piece of the mutant dragon he had defeated, and began preparing it. He molded the ground around the fire with magic to create an improvised grill. Both Ghislaine and Eris watched in fascination as he manipulated the elements with incredible skill. Eris was the first to speak, her eyes shining with curiosity. "Hey, how do you do that?" Ghislaine, more serious, added, "Indeed, I'm also surprised. I've seen some mages in my life, but none of them were capable of what you're showing. Your magical proficiency is almost unbelievable, considering you must be only 12 or 13 years old." As she spoke, Ghislaine observed Rigger closely with her magic eye. Noticing the strain was beginning to weigh on her vision, her normal eye patch was lost during the battle with the dragons. She tore a piece of cloth from her clothes and improvised a new one to rest the overworked eye. Rigger chuckled lightly, looking at both of them but mostly at Ghislaine. "That's chantless magic. It's certainly a rare skill, but you could say I had the best teacher to teach me magic. And to correct you, I'm 10 years old, miss." Ghislaine's eyes narrowed, not with distrust but rather careful analysis. Before she could respond, Rigger continued, looking directly at her, "I've heard many stories about Ghislaine Adoldia in the Great Forest. None of them were very good. I never imagined you become such a powerful swordswoman after leaving." Eris crossed her arms with a proud smile as if the compliment were directed at her. Ghislaine, on the other hand, maintained her serious demeanor, studying Rigger. Finally, she spoke, "From what I see in your movements, you're also a practitioner of the sword god style." "Yes," Rigger replied, inclining his head slightly, "but not as skilled as you." Ghislaine raised an eyebrow. "You're also a very powerful mage. I've never heard of that lightning magic you used. It's extremely fast and hard to dodge." Rigger smiled, his eyes narrowing. "Even so, I don't think it'd be fast enough to use against you in a fight." Ghislaine remained silent for a moment before responding, her voice laced with respect. "Perhaps not." Eris, gradually regaining her energy now that Ghislaine was awake, interrupted the exchange of words with a direct challenge. "Hey, so you know how to use a sword too, don't you? Fight me. But no magic." Rigger looked at her with an amused expression as he pulled the skewers from the fire. He had found some herbs and natural spices around the cave and was curious to test their flavor on the meat. Calmly, he asked, "And your sword? Where is it?" Eris looked around, confused, before blushing as she realized she had lost it during the fight in the cave. Rigger chuckled softly, though his eyes gleamed with interest. He recalled watching her as they ran into the cave. Eris's instinctive use of Tuki was promising, though she herself seemed unaware of it. Testing her would be interesting. "Forget it," he said as he used earth magic to create a stone sword. Tossing it to her, he created another one for himself. "Take this." Eris hesitated for a moment, but soon grinned and assumed a stance from the sword god style, her eager smile revealing her excitement. She had the look of a beast, and Rigger couldn't help but wonder if she was of mixed blood. She was truly ferocious and seemed impatient to fight him. "Haria!" she yelled, charging with a wild cry. Rigger didn't move. He stopped her strike with ease, holding his stone sword firmly. Eris stepped back and attacked again, this time switching between several different positions. Rigger remained impassive, carefully analyzing her movements. After a few moments, he sighed, disappointed. "Is that all?" Before she could reply, he moved his sword swiftly, disarming her with a light strike to her wrist. The stone blade was pointed at her neck before she could recover. Eris froze, her eyes wide in shock. "You've got talent," Rigger said, pulling the sword back. "But you need a lot of training to be a real threat." Eris clenched her fists, furious, while Ghislaine observed the scene with an appraising look. The young man seemed far more skilled than she had expected, and not just in magic. An advanced swordsman could easily defeat Eris, but not like this. He hadn't exerted himself at all, as if he were merely evaluating her skills. "Young lady, don't bother challenging him again. He's already at the sword saint level," Ghislaine stated emotionlessly. Eris stared at her in shock and chose to deny it. "Him? Impossible." Ghislaine then turned her gaze to Rigger. Though her expression didn't show it, she too was extremely surprised. Rigger merely smiled as Eris grew increasingly frustrated. Changing the subject, Rigger decided to steer the conversation in a different direction. "How did you end up in the cave?" He looked directly at Ghislaine, expecting an explanation. The swordswoman seemed to ponder for a moment. "We were in Roa, in the Azura Kingdom, when it happened." She paused, searching for the right words. A white light exploded after a large concentration of mana appeared in the sky. "The next thing I knew, we were thrown into this cave. There were blue dragons everywhere. They attacked us the moment we arrived." Eris remained silent, clenching her fists. Rigger nodded, visualizing the scene. He could imagine the fierce battle against the creatures and the desperation of finding shelter. "What about the rest of the city? Do you think the entire city of Roa was affected? Was everyone teleported?" Ghislaine seemed to consider this. "I don't know. We didn't see anyone else in the cave with us. It might have been a local event, or something much larger." Rigger fell silent for a moment, reflecting on the implications. If it was an isolated incident, their luck was worse than he'd imagined. But if an entire city, or even more places, had been affected, the impact would be catastrophic. "So you don't know who or what caused this?" Rigger pressed. "No," Ghislaine replied in a tone that closed the topic. Meanwhile, the aroma of roasted meat began to fill the cave, bringing a temporary sense of calm. The confrontation might have ended, but the respect and curiosity between them had only started to grow. Rigger silently observed as Ghislaine grabbed one of the skewers and bit into the meat, her serious expression unchanged. Beside her, Eris, still furious over the fight, and seemingly frustrated for some reason, grabbed another skewer. She eyed the meat with a mix of doubt and determination before taking her first bite. It didn't take long for Rigger to notice their reactions. Ghislaine remained expressionless, chewing slowly, while Eris made a slight grimace but said nothing. "Didn't like it?" Rigger asked, intrigued. "To be honest, I've never been a good cook." Ghislaine stared at him, her voice firm as she replied, "It's very good. I've eaten worse." Eris, who seemed on the verge of complaining, glanced at Ghislaine and quickly agreed. "Yes, It's good. Rigger frowned. He was absolutely certain the meat was terrible. He tried it himself and almost spat out the first bite. The meat was overcooked. The spices he'd found were nothing more than moss that left a faint muddy taste, and the smell was a strange mix of smoke and damp earth. Still, while Eris was clearly lying just to agree with Ghislaine, he could see in the swordswoman's eyes that she was being sincere. That left him both confused and curious. What could be worse than this? He shook his head, unable to find an answer. Taking a deep breath, he changed the subject. We'll stay here until tomorrow. By my estimation, you should be fully recovered by then. He paused, nodding toward the cave entrance. The dragons are still agitated. With any luck, things will calm down by tomorrow, and we can head to the dwarves' city. You can rest there before continuing your journey. Ghislaine finished her skewer and stood, crossing her arms as she stared at him. She remained silent for a few moments as if evaluating something. Finally, she asked directly, "Why are you helping us? I'm still indebted to you for saving us, but what's your reason for continuing to guide us?" The question made Rigger pause for a moment. He stared into the campfire, trying to formulate an answer. At first, he thought of the justification he had given himself before and planned to tell them. Ghislaine was of the same race as him. Perhaps it was natural to help her. But as he reflected more deeply, he realized that wasn't all. There was something more. He was intrigued by Ghislaine. She was the first person he had encountered who truly seemed stronger than him after reaching the Sword Saint level. Until now, he hadn't met anyone individually as strong as he was. Not the black troll he fought, not Fendrel, not Gallus, nor any of the dwarf warriors in the dwarves' city. None had given him a real sense of threat. Ghislaine was different. Even after reaching the Sword Saint level and king rank in 2 magic disciplines, Rigger had never felt a clearer threat than when he saw her fighting the dragons. Of course, he could easily win if he attacked from a distance, but he was almost certain he'd lose his head before he could do anything if he fought her up close. Furthermore, there was still Haitagami. Could he tell that he wasn't acting exactly as he wanted? Beyond that, the teleportation incident also piqued his curiosity. And Eris, being a noble, could be a valuable asset in his long-term plans for the Iron Legion. Finally, he smiled at Ghislaine, a light, almost teasing but honest smile. "Just curiosity," he replied. Ghislaine narrowed her eyes but didn't press further. She turned and returned to where she had been sitting, seeming to accept the answer. The improvised wooden sword cut through the air with force, a hum that filled the silent mountainous road. A child, Eris Boreas Grerat, her hair as red as fire, felt sweat trickling down her forehead as she swung the sword, gritting her teeth in frustration. Each swing was a muffled cry, an attempt to ease the turmoil boiling within her. Anger at the situation, the strange place they were in, and at herself. She paused for a moment, panting, hands on her knees as she took a deep breath. She glanced to the side, where an enormous stone cart rested. It was so massive it seemed impossible to move, yet there it was, perfectly functional, with solid stone wheels and a blue dragon's corpse inside. 2 days had passed since they left the cave, and her anger and frustration grew daily. She was grateful he had saved them and planned to ask her grandfather to reward him, but he wasn't helping her mood at all. Not that he mistreated her, but he wouldn't give in to her demands and would match her aggression with equal stubbornness. She'd learned the hard way that she had no chance of defeating him. She had even asked Ghislaine to teach him a lesson once she recovered from her injuries, but she refused. The thought hit her like a flood. She gripped the sword hilt tightly and looked at the stone transport he had crafted. Besides being so strong, he also had those strange magics. She hadn't found anything he couldn't do with magic. Everything seemed so convenient for him. How could someone be so infuriating and impressive at the same time? When he made that cart, Eris had almost wanted to jump up and scream in excitement. It was just so cool. He said it wasn't difficult, but when he tried to explain, well, she and Ghislaine had exchanged confused looks. Nothing he said made sense. It was something about forces, levers, and other words she couldn't even pronounce. She wanted to learn magic, but she refused to ask him for help. She returned to swinging the sword, now with more force, as if the blade could cut through the thoughts tormenting her. Each strike made her emotions clearer. He's an amazing mage. According to Ghislaine, he's absurdly skilled with a sword too. She bit her lip, remembering how she had miserably lost to him when she challenged him. She had even thought for a moment about ambushing him while he slept. But he had saved her. He had saved Ghislaine too. And that made her hesitate. He's so arrogant. Always talking about complicated things like it's easy. Like he wants to show off how much smarter he is. I feel stupid every time I talk to him. And yet. She let out a grunt and swung the sword harder, the blade humming louder. Why does he have to be so cute? She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to calm herself, but an image formed in her mind. Rigger's ears, always alert, swaying gently in the wind. His tail, seemingly alive, swaying back and forth as his emotions dictated. It was cute. Annoyingly cute. Eris suddenly opened her eyes as if the vision were an affront. She felt her cheeks burn and swung the sword with all her strength. I can't think that. I can't. She was about to scream, but a sound from the forest interrupted her. A crash. Loud enough to make her stop mid-swing and turn her head quickly toward the noise. Eris took a deep breath. Didn't they go that way earlier? POV, Rigor. I raced through the mountains like lightning ripping across the morning sky. My feet barely touched the ground before propelling me forward again, and wherever I passed, the terrain roared and collapsed, rocks flying high from the impact's force and speed, causing shockwaves. My speed was insane, but the danger behind me was even greater. I sensed the threat before I saw it. Without much thought, I instinctively raised a massive earthen wall, as dense as I could shape it in the minimal time I had. This should buy me a few seconds, I thought. But my instincts, sharp as blades, screamed in warning. With a burst step, I vanished from my position as the ground collapsed from an explosion. In that instant, I heard it. No, I felt it. An absolute slash ripping through the world. The air seemed to falter, and the still-forming wall I had created was sliced horizontally in a clean, lethal line. Not just the wall, but the ground, the rocks, and even the horizon within reach of the strike had been cut. And there, behind that perfect cut, I saw her. Ghislaine Dedoldia. A beast in human form. Her silver hair whipped wildly in the wind, and the green glow of her magic eye seemed to pierce my soul. Despite her absurd speed, her presence was impossible to ignore. She wielded Hiramyun, the sword given to her by her master, and her stance exuded menace and strength. When was the last time I had to flee for my life in a fight? I thought quickly, trying to ignore the cold shiver running down my spine. Ah yes. The mutant wolf in the great forest. But this is different. This is worse. My blue sword, Tsukikage, roared at my command, enveloping itself in intense flames. With a single motion, I unleashed a flaming wave in her direction. A wave of fire that would have reduced any ordinary enemy to ashes. But Ghislaine was not ordinary. The ground ahead was obliterated, stones melting and trees being destroyed. But she vanished in the middle of the attack. I lost sight of her for a second and felt the air around me shift. Damn. She can see when I'm about to cast magic with that magic eye. The world turned into a silver blur as she charged toward me. My sword rose instinctively to block the strike, but something felt off. At the last second, my instincts saved me again. With hurried magic, I conjured a transparent physical barrier around my neck. The clang resounded like thunder. Even so, the blood-colored blade sliced through the barrier with little resistance, stopping mere millimeters from cutting into my flesh. I had saved my life by a thread, but the impact was enough to make me stumble a few steps back. Finally, I managed to see her clearly. Fierce. Relentless. A true predator. Her eyes shone with determination, and her face remained expressionless, befitting a seasoned warrior. Her speed was overwhelming, her attacks calculated with deadly precision. She was faster, stronger, fiercer than me. Even her senses seemed to surpass mine. The only reason I was still alive was my versatility with magic. She charged again, and I barely had time to defend. Rising pillar. The ground exploded into a giant column in her path. but Ghislaine split it in two before it could even hit her. I seized the second of opportunity and shot an electric blast directly at her. Lightning! The bolt roared toward its target, but Ghislaine dodged with superhuman agility, using the explosion of light and debris to conceal herself before rushing at me like a bullet. I raised my flaming sword to block, but her strike was so strong that the shock reverberated through my entire arm. The stones around us cracked. She didn't stop. Ghislaine was a whirlwind of blades, and I was the prey trying to survive. Every attack was too fast to follow and too powerful to ignore. Within moments, I was covered in cuts of varying depths. Explosive circle. The ground around us erupted in flames, but she leapt out of the area as if she already knew what I was going to do. She reads all my magical moves with that eye, but it's more than that. Even if she can see them, it should be impossible to always make the best decision. She doesn't make mistakes. I retreated, casting healing magic to close the deep cuts and burns already marking my arms and legs. My breath was slightly labored, something I hadn't felt in a long time, and the tension in my muscles was evident. But she charged again. I kept my guard up, but I couldn't find any openings. Ghislaine gave no openings. Not a single mistake. As I thought that, I felt something to my left. I moved Tsukikage to intercept the strike, only for it to pass through an afterimage. Damn it. I realized it too late. Before I could swing my short sword to block the real attack, I felt Hiramien's blade graze my neck. A small trickle of blood dripped before she stopped. I looked at her, panting, facing the 6 feet 1 inch woman who was smiling slightly with a fierce gaze. Even after such an intense battle, she seemed in complete control. I smiled, exhausted. I lost. Ghislaine sheathed her sword, relaxing her stance but still radiating authority. Your magic is truly dangerous. If I were ambushed from long range, I wouldn't stand a chance. She looked at me seriously. You just need a few more years to completely surpass me. Even hearing that, my admiration for her only grew. She was formidable, yet she looked at all possibilities objectively, without arrogance or humility. I sheathed my sword, taking a deep breath, and glanced far off where Eris should be waiting for us. We had already left the dangerous dragon territory, so we left her there while we fought. Let's head back. She must be tired of waiting. And side by side, we began our way back, as the mountains echoed the roars of the battle we had just fought. The way back was silent, interrupted only by the rhythmic sound of Rigor and Ghislaine's steps on the beaten earth. The wind gently rustled the leaves of the surrounding trees, carrying with it the damp scent of the forest. In the distance, Rigor's stone cart could be seen, carrying the corpse of the blue dragon he had hunted. He glanced at Ghislaine, who walked with a firm yet relaxed posture of an experienced warrior. Despite the strength she exuded, there was something more, a sense of discipline, like a beast that only attacked at the right moment. Ghislaine, he called, breaking the silence. She turned her head and saw the golden eyes fixed on her attentively. I would like you to be my sword master, he said, looking at her expectantly. For a moment, she held his gaze, assessing him as if trying to gauge his determination. Then, she slowly shook her head. I can't accept, she replied, her voice firm but not harsh. You're already nearing my strength. It wouldn't be appropriate for me to become your master. If you truly wish to learn, perhaps only my master could take you as a disciple. Rigor frowned, intrigued. Gol Farayon? Is he much stronger than you? He had never met a god-ranked warrior, but he assumed they must be incredibly powerful, or they wouldn't have such a title. Recently, however, he began to think that perhaps he wasn't that far from that rank. This wasn't due to ignorance or arrogance, but rather the absolute confidence people placed in him. Anyone who experienced such a sense of strength would develop this confidence, especially when every enemy he encountered couldn't defeat him by a wide margin, and only had a chance in groups. After all, he had been a human in his previous life and was now capable of wiping mountains off the map and moving at supersonic speeds. Who wouldn't develop some confidence after that? Ghislaine nodded. He's the strongest person I know. I've never faced anyone who came close to his power. If there's someone who can teach you something I cannot, it's him. Rigor crossed his arms, thoughtful. From the few days he had spent with her, he knew Ghislaine wasn't the type to underestimate her own strength, so her mention of Gol Farayon as a much superior warrior sparked an inevitable curiosity and battle intent. "I plan to travel there soon," Rigger said, looking at the horizon, "but the journey will be long, and I don't want to stagnate during that time. So, would you at least be my instructor to help me reach Sword King level?" Ghislaine pondered for a moment, her face remaining impassive. "That wouldn't be a problem," she said with a slight nod. "But in return, I'd like to ask you a favor." Rigger raised an eyebrow. "A favor?" He paused for a moment. "What would that be?" "I'd like you to help us return to the Azura Kingdom," Ghislaine began. Her voice carried a serious tone and an unexpected emotional weight. "Neither Eris nor I know how to read, write, or do arithmetic. Besides, many have told me that I'm not very intelligent. I traveled alone for a while after my adventure group dissolved. By then, I had already become a sword queen and faced several near-death situations, problems my sword couldn't solve. I ended up being sold as a slave in the end before being saved by the Boreas family." She paused, as if carefully choosing her words. "I thought I could protect her from any opponents along the way, but now I'm not so sure. I also can't properly feed her, give her a place to sleep, or even know the right direction to the Azura Kingdom. I could ask around, but that didn't work out very well last time. With your strength, intelligence, and magic, I believe we'd have a better chance of completing this mission." Rigger noticed a slight tremor in her voice, though it wasn't from weakness. It was as if she were forcing herself to ask for help, something clearly uncomfortable for someone so proud. "You've already saved my life and Eris's," she continued, "and I already owe you a great debt. But for the young lady's safety, I'm asking for this additional favor. If you accept, I'll owe you for the rest of my life and ensure you're rewarded." Ghislaine seemed extremely serious, but Rigger didn't find it difficult. He liked Ghislaine and wouldn't let her out of his sight so easily. At that moment, they arrived where Eris was. The young girl was training incessantly, swinging her improvised sword against the air beside the cart. She didn't even look at them when they arrived, focused on each strike, with sweat running down her determined face. Rigger lowered his gaze to the ground, lost in thought. Was this a coincidence? I see no reason not to help them. In fact, I want to help. But would I just be following Hitagami's plans if I agree? Or does he even have plans? While Ghislaine waited patiently, he pondered for a few moments, battling the nagging feeling of being manipulated. Finally, he took a deep breath and decided, I hope I'm just overthinking this. All right, he said, looking at Ghislaine. I'll be happy to help. But know that I won't travel there immediately. Can you stay with the Iron Legion for a few months? Ghislaine remained silent for a moment, considering the proposal. Before she could respond, Eris, who seemed oblivious to the conversation, stopped training and looked at them curiously. That won't be a problem, Ghislaine finally replied. As long as it's not for too long. Rigger smiled and, with a mischievous glint in his eye, turned to Eris, who was now watching them with a confused expression and a slight blush on her face. Looks like we're officially travel companions, young lady. He swore he saw steam coming out of her ears as the redhead fumed with rage, her face completely red. Rigger chuckled softly, but quickly looked back to the horizon. Time to upgrade my sword. And with that thought, he kept walking, his determination renewed to face whatever lay ahead. In the middle of the mountains, a massive wagon, resembling a sealed stone box, moved slowly. Atop the wagon, 3 figures could be seen. A tall beast woman with silver hair and an eye patch, sitting cross-legged. A little red-haired girl apparently trying to mimic the woman's posture. And a young beast boy with golden eyes, seemingly in the early stages of adolescence. If a traveler were to pass by and witness the harmonious scene of the 3 talking casually, they might find it unbelievable after noticing the enormous dead blue dragon inside the wagon. And so, I decided to start training the children of the tribe to defend themselves. I honestly didn't imagine at first that it would grow into something so significant, Rigger explained to them. He was describing the Iron Legion, recounting its beginnings and the frequent attacks by slavers that had pushed him to start the group. Ghislaine listened without much reaction, while Eris appeared enthralled, finding the story thrilling. Almost everyone in the tribe supported it because, at the time, there was real uncertainty about whether the children were safe. But there were also some obstacles, Rigger said, glancing directly at Ghislaine. Your brother didn't like me much after I started showing wilder traits. Actually, he didn't like you either. Among the Dodoldia tribe, many don't think of you very positively. Did you know that? The warrior remained silent, her expression unreadable as she looked away. What? Eris practically shouted, jumping to her feet with her hands on her hips. What do you mean they don't think of her positively? Rigger shrugged, maintaining his calm demeanor. Many see her as a wild girl who was supposed to be the next leader of the Dodoldia tribe, but was irrational and violent. And that's how it was until she was taken by a wandering swordsman passing through the great forest. But no one tried to stop him. That's ridiculous. Eris began ranting, as if it were his fault for repeating what he had heard. Wild? She's amazing. Strong, fast, smart. She taught me how to fight. And. Eris clenched her fists, fuming. She always comes to help me when I call. Ghislaine finally turned to face them, her single visible red eye resting on Eris. They're not wrong, Eris. The simple statement hit the girl like a bucket of cold water, and her eyes widened. What? What do you mean? When I was a child, I was violent, Ghislaine explained with her usual calmness. I fought everyone, even my younger brother. I respected no one. I'd pick fights over anything. I barely learned to speak the beast god's language. Eris blinked, confused, her mouth opening and closing as she tried to process this. But Ghislaine is the most incredible person I know. Rigger intervened, just in time. It wasn't her fault she was so wild. It wasn't something she could control. Ghislaine raised an eyebrow slightly, showing the faintest hint of curiosity. And why is that? He paused for a moment, as if organizing his thoughts, before continuing. It's a theory I heard from an elf named Ilya in the long-eared tribe. She had a theory about us, the beast race. She believed that the more talented someone is, the wilder they tend to be in childhood. She personally met a member of the beast race who managed to control their wildness by mastering and manipulating their Tuki. She studied later generations and came up with this theory. He paused, then added, looking at your example, I'm even more convinced that this theory is true. The warrior crossed her arms, studying Rigger with a mix of interest and skepticism. It makes sense to some extent, she murmured, almost to herself. Eris was just watching, trying to grasp something from the conversation. Ghislaine tilted her head slightly, scrutinizing Rigger with a sharp gaze. Her red eye seemed to scan him from head to toe, as if searching for something hidden within him. You seem to know a thing or two about Tuki, Rigger, so you must realize your theory breaks down with you. You said you're only 10 years old this year, yet you seem much more rational than I ever was. And you're also more talented with a sword and magic. Rigger noticed her gaze and gave a small smile before responding, well, let's just say I'm an exception. Eris narrowed her eyes, now more curious than confused. Exception. Ghislaine pressed. When I was younger, I also had a lot of trouble controlling my instincts. Some instances were even worse than yours. I was closer to being a beast than a person, he admitted, averting his gaze. His voice lowered as he recalled those moments. But I'm also pretty rational, as you said. I sought a solution when I realized I was losing control, and I found one. It was only after reaching the saint level of swordsmanship that I stopped losing myself. Ghislaine said nothing, but there was something in her posture that suggested she was reflecting on his words. Her tail swayed slightly, a barely noticeable gesture that Rigger caught. Eris, on the other hand, crossed her arms and huffed again. I didn't understand any of that. But Ghislaine is amazing, right? Rigger chuckled softly, Eris's straightforward sincerity catching him off guard. He nodded. Yes, Ghislaine is amazing. He glanced at the warrior again and noticed a faint smile on her usually stoic face. His gaze lingered momentarily on the large scar running across her exposed abdomen. The question of how she had gotten it almost slipped from his lips, but he held back. Ghislaine noticed the glance but didn't react. Instead, She turned toward the horizon. "Let's train, Eris." Eris excitedly jumped to her feet to join her, while Rigger stayed behind to practice his control over barrier magic, which had proven to be highly useful as of late. While training, his thoughts drifted to Ghislaine and all the stories that had shaped her life. Ghislaine was a formidable warrior, but behind her strength lay much that he still wanted to understand. The fresh mountain breeze caressed Rigger's face as he took in the surrounding landscape. They were on a dirt road, surrounded by towering rock formations and cliffs dotted with low vegetation. In the distance, snow-capped peaks stood out against a bright blue sky almost devoid of clouds. The constant sound of wind echoed between the stones, creating a peaceful atmosphere despite the grueling journey. Rigger, his eyes fixed ahead, guided the large stone cart he had created himself. The weight of the dead mutant dragon it carried was immense, but his magic made the task seem effortless. Atop the cart, Eris practiced with an improvised stone sword, striking the air with determined, repetitive movements. Ghislaine stood nearby, observing her with a serious expression, occasionally correcting her posture with brief instructions. Rigger glanced at the scene and sighed. "She's really training hard," he thought. "Ghislaine told me Eris has always enjoyed sword training, but ever since they left the Blue Dragon Cave, her dedication has intensified. Ghislaine thinks it's because of me, being only a year older and already a sword saint, but I'm not so sure." He diverted his gaze to his own hands as he tried to form a small whirlwind, experimenting with the wind flow to create a perfect vortex. The magic danced between his fingers, but the vortex lost control. He sighed again, letting it dissipate into the air. After spending some time with Eris, it was easy to understand her personality. She was a typical tsundere, someone who struggled to express feelings directly and used aggression or violence as a way of communicating. Yet her actions spoke louder than her words. From Ghislaine's accounts, it was likely that the near-death experience in the cave had left her with a sense of helplessness. That's understandable. But now, maybe my presence has given her hope that she too can become as strong as me. He looked back at Eris, who continued to strike the air ferociously. Ghislaine corrected her grip on the sword, and the girl grumbled something unintelligible before adjusting her stance. Rigger allowed a faint smile to cross his lips. Maybe it's a mix of everything, he pondered. She wants to overcome what happened in the cave and doesn't want to be a burden to Ghislaine again. But she also wants to surpass me. That's not a bad thing. Strength is never wasted in this world. And her fierce personality. I haven't met another 9-year-old who wouldn't have had their spirit crushed after being surrounded by dragons. As he mused, the sound of swift footsteps echoed along the road. The noise grew louder, and Rigger immediately recognized the rhythm. He smiled and leaped lightly from the cart, halting the vehicle with a simple gesture. The ground beneath it shifted to stabilize the load. A dark figure appeared among the rocks. A large wolf with ebony fur raced toward him with elegance and agility. Its amber eyes gleamed with excitement as it leapt directly at Rigger, who greeted it with a soft laugh. Skoll was imposing, with a muscular frame and a glossy coat that shimmered under the mountain sun. The wolf licked Rigger's face, and he responded by stroking its head. "You're getting big, huh, Skoll?" Rigger commented as he tried to push the wolf off him. "Soon I'll need to find another way to bring you into the city." Eris and Ghislaine descended from the cart to watch the wolf. Eris's eyes sparkled with excitement as she looked at Skoll, almost bouncing with enthusiasm. "Rigger, can I pet him?" Eris asked, trying to contain her excitement, though not very successfully. Rigger chuckled. "Only if he lets you." He turned to the wolf and made a silent signal, seeking its permission. Skoll tilted his head for a moment, as if considering the idea, before approaching Eris cautiously. She carefully extended her hand and touched his soft fur. Her eyes lit up even more, and a wide smile spread across her face. Ghislaine, however, remained quiet. Her expression was serene, but her eyes betrayed a slight wariness as she observed the wolf. Despite her trust in Rigger, Skoll was still a wild and powerful creature. She crossed her arms and gave a slight nod, acknowledging the bond between the boy and the animal. "This is Skoll," Rigger introduced. "He's my companion. I found him attacking a slave market, and he's followed me ever since." Eris looked fascinated. Do you have more like him? Rigger laughed again, stroking the wolf. Unfortunately, the others already have owners. We might need to find him a mate if we want more like him. As Eris continued to admire the wolf, Rigger glanced around. The mountainous landscape seemed even more beautiful under the sunlight. The tranquility of the moment contrasted sharply with the challenges they had faced in the dragon cave. He took a deep breath, savoring the crisp, fresh air filling his lungs. Skoll's arrival meant they were close to the Brightstone Forge. Ghislaine now walked alongside the cart, her vigilant posture unchanged, while Eris laughed gleefully as she played with Skoll, who bounded and twisted with youthful energy, trying to reach her on top of the vehicle. Rigger smiled lightly as he watched Skoll enjoying himself. He sometimes forgot the wolf was still a pup, brimming with energy. Moreover, it seemed like the first time he had seen Eris act like a normal 9-year-old girl. Soon, the Brightstone Forge came into view along the mountainside, marked by a massive stone-carved entrance flanked by eternal torches that burned with steady flames. Rigger slowed the cart and carefully parked it, dispersing the magic propelling it. "We're here," he said as he hopped to the ground. Skoll was already circling them, full of energy. As they walked toward the cavern entrance, Ghislaine approached and asked, "Why exactly do you want to embed a magic stone in your sword?" Her tone was curious but firm. Rigger looked at her, choosing his words carefully. "I want my sword to function like a staff," he explained. "My fighting style combines swordsmanship and magic in combat. My magic master, Verdia, gave me this sword, which can withstand extreme heat, a trait that's already proven very useful. I can only imagine what I could do with an integrated casting focus." Ghislaine merely nodded silently, absorbing the explanation as her eyes returned to scanning the path ahead. Rigger noticed that she seemed to weigh every word carefully before responding, a trait he found intriguing. Meanwhile, Eris continued playing with Skoll. Rigger advanced toward the entrance of the cave and knocked on the massive wooden door reinforced with metal. He waited a few moments, the sound of his heartbeat echoing off the surrounding rocks. In his mind, he wondered about the dwarf Fort Wind. Did he return to the dwarven city? "I think we stayed in the Blue Dragon Cave longer than planned. Maybe they assumed I had died." His thoughts were interrupted as the door swung open with a loud bang, and a powerful laugh echoed from the small yet imposing figure of Brightstone. "I knew it. I knew you could do it. Ha ha ha," exclaimed the dwarf, his broad smile nearly disappearing beneath his thick beard. Rigger allowed a faint smile as he pulled the blue dragon's magical stone from his bag. Brightstone almost snatched it from his hands, his eyes sparkling with fascination as he immediately began examining it, muttering to himself while performing various quick tests using tools pulled from his pockets. As the dwarf worked, Rigger gave him a sharp look. "Your magical concealment items were incredibly useful. The battle would have been much harder without them. And for the dwarves, it would have been almost impossible, even with those items to help." Brightstone paused for a moment, letting out a short chuckle. "Things of the past, boy, things of the past," he said before glancing at Ghislaine for the first time. His eyes gleamed with curiosity as he asked, "And who's the musclehead?" "Your wife." Rigger blinked, surprised by the question, and glanced at Ghislaine briefly before responding, "No, I saved her in a blue dragon cave, actually. It's a long story. And I'm only 10 years old, you know." The dwarf just laughed and returned to examining the magical stone. After a few minutes, Brightstone seemed satisfied and stood up. "I'll start working on your sword immediately. Don't bother me." Before retreating, he cast a glance at Ghislaine's waist, where her sword Hiramion was sheathed. "That one for sale?" Ghislaine remained expressionless, and her response was curt and direct, "No." The dwarf chuckled lightly. "What a serious woman." Rigger then said, "I'm taking the dragon's carcass and having a feast with Godbard. You don't want to join us?" "No, I don't like parties, nor am I welcome among those hypocrites," he grumbled as he began to work. Rigger left the sword and the magical stone with Brightstone and returned to the wagon. Ghislaine commented, "What an eccentric person." Tallhand was eccentric too. "Are all dwarves like this?" Rigger chuckled softly. "Everyone has their quirks. As they returned to the dwarven city, Eris was riding Skoll, who leapt between peaks and cliffs with boundless energy. It was a scene of pure childhood joy, something that stood in stark contrast to the recent battles and hardships. The dwarven city stretched before Rigger and his group like a living stone wall, the sound of forges and hammers striking metal echoing through the mountain. As the cart approached the city's entrance, one of the guards at the gate couldn't hold back his laughter and began laughing loudly. The other, wearing a sour expression, side-eyed his colleague and muttered something incomprehensible. Rigger jumped down from the cart and approached the guards, curious about their reaction. The first guard, still struggling to stop laughing, finally spoke, "Thanks, Rigger. I earned myself a vacation because of you." Rigger frowned, completely confused. Vacation? How? The grumpier guard crossed his arms and explained with a sigh, "We bet whether you'd come back alive or dead. Whoever lost had to cover the other's shifts for 2 months. Guess who lost?" Rigger was initially shocked, but then found it amusing. The grumpy guard glanced at Ghislaine and Eris sitting in the cart and asked, raising an eyebrow, "Ho, who are the ladies? Friends of yours?" "You could put it that way," Rigger replied with a crooked smile. "The swordswoman, there is a sword king." The guard's eyes widened, and he practically choked. "What?" "Yeah, she's a sword king. But don't worry, she won't do anything suspicious. She ended up here by accident. They're coming with me. Oh, and hope you're not on duty tonight. There's a well-preserved dragon corpse in this cart, and I'm planning a grand feast. Whoever's on duty will miss out," Rigger added with a semi-serious tone, though a mischievous smile danced on his lips. The laughing guard burst into even louder laughter. "I'm on duty tonight. But lucky for me, a good friend of mine will be covering for me. Ha ha ha." The grumpy guard huffed, clearly unamused by the situation. Rigger laughed and, paying little attention to the sour guard, led the cart into the dwarven city. Back on the cart, Eris looked around and exclaimed, "They're short." Ghislaine, sitting next to her, seemed somewhat impressed by the city's unique architecture. "I've never been to the dwarven city. Tallhand always said they make the best weapons in the world." "Except for the 49 swords of Yulian Jalisco, I'd say they do make the best weapons," Rigger replied thoughtfully, observing the dwarves bustling around. He turned to Ghislaine. "Do you have any money on you?" Ghislaine gave him a blank look, and Rigger sighed, already knowing the answer. Along the way, many dwarves curiously watched the group, particularly the 2 new women in the cart. At one point, a young dwarf with a youthful face pointed at Eris and asked, "Mom, why is her hair so red?" Unable to tolerate the teasing, Eris leaped from the cart and shouted, her expression fierce, "Do you have a problem with that?" The boy flinched, frightened by Eris's intensity, and hid behind his mother, who looked at her with disapproval. Noticing the situation was about to escalate, Rigger intervened with a firm voice, "Eris, don't cause a scene. This isn't Fatoa. Besides, I think your red hair is very beautiful." Eris turned to him, ready to retort, but as she heard the last part, her face flushed slightly. She clenched her teeth and turned away quickly, huffing like a true tsundere. "Humph," was all she said before turning her gaze forward, trying to hide the slight blush on her cheeks. Soon, they arrived at Godbard's home, where a guard stood waiting for Rigger. As he saw them, he approached with a smile. "Oh, Lord Rigger, the Ore God has finished the short sword you requested. He's preparing to forge now. Would you like to see him?" Rigger immediately nodded, his expression serious. He turned to Eris before stepping down from the cart and said firmly, "Eris, stay here with Skoll. Ghislaine and I will talk to Godbard." Eris crossed her arms, clearly displeased, but didn't argue. She simply nodded with a slight huff while watching Rigger and Ghislaine enter the imposing forge. The furnace was already lit, and the scorching heat made the air shimmer. The sound of hammers striking and metal screeching filled the environment. Godbard, the Ore God, was intently sorting through a pile of precious metals. His robust figure, with a beard braided into iron rings, radiated authority. Rigger stepped forward and called out, "Godbard, they told me you finished my short sword." The dwarf raised his head at the sound of the voice and broke into a wide grin. "Rigger, So you're alive. Ha 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 ha. He approached and gave Rigger a few firm pats on the shoulder, nearly making him lose his balance. Godbard then turned his gaze to Ghislaine, who stood firm, her penetrating eyes watching him. His gaze dropped to the sword at her waist, and his playful smile faded, replaced by a serious expression. Straightening his posture, he asked, "Who is she?" Ghislaine remained stoic, but Rigger intervened before she could reply. "She's Ghislaine de Doldia, the Sword King, also known as the Black Wolf." Godbard continued, "What is a warrior of such renown doing in Dwarven territory? Don't tell me she's looking to trade Hiramian." She and her disciple, Eris Greyrat, were caught in a mana disaster in the Fatoa region and teleported to the territory of the Blue Dragons. The dwarf raised his eyebrows, clearly surprised. That again? 2 days ago, someone else showed up claiming to be from the same region, Fatoa. Rigger and Ghislaine exchanged quick glances, their eyes narrowing with interest. Ghislaine was the first to ask, "Could you tell me where that person is now?" Godbard scratched his nose as he thought. He gave the money he had in exchange for joining a caravan that left yesterday for Tinaver. They're probably a bit far by now, but he mentioned something about a place called Buena Village. He was a blonde half-elf. Ghislaine furrowed her brow in concentration before murmuring, "Then it's confirmed. It wasn't just the two of us. Probably all, or at least most, of the citizens of Fatoa were teleported. That's both good and bad. It increases the chances they're alive, at least." Rigger nodded and asked, "What was his name? We'll catch up to that caravan eventually." Godbard snapped his fingers as if trying to remember and shouted outside, "Hey, what was the name of that blonde half-elf who passed through here the other day?" One of the guards replied, "Laws. That was his name." Godbard nodded in agreement and turned back to Rigger. "Laws. That was the name. Now, let's get to the point." He walked over to a table in the forge and picked up a sheathed sword. The sheath was adorned with intricate golden details, exuding elegance and power. "Here's your short sword." He drew the sword from its sheath, revealing a blade of black gold, gleaming intensely. Along the blade, 2 small magic stones were embedded, radiating energy. "I named it Night Hunter. What do you think?" Godbard handed the sword to Rigger, who held it with both hands, examining every detail. He closed his eyes for a moment and felt the mana flow through the blade. It was incredibly responsive, amplifying his earth magic by up to 4 times and other types of magic by about 2 or 3 times. "It's exactly what I asked for, every detail." Rigger smiled, impressed. "You really live up to the title of God of Oregon." Godbard burst into laughter. "Ha ha ha. Of course I do, boy. If I didn't, the name of the dwarves would be a joke." Godbard said, "This sword certainly has 1 or 2 magical effects, but you will only discover this by using it and finding out more about it. Normally these skills are like a bet. Something very good or so or less could come of it." "Okay, that's no problem." Rigger carefully sheathed the sword and took the opportunity to inform him of his plans. "I'm planning to host a feast with the meat from the mutant dragon I killed. However, I'll need the help of the dwarves joining the Iron Legion. They could transport the scales, fangs, and tendons of the mutant dragon and another dragon I killed to our headquarters." Godbard crossed his arms and nodded. "That can be arranged. After all, a mutant dragon isn't something you see every day. I'm sure many will want to taste a piece of that feast." After discussing some details, Rigger and Ghislaine left the forge. They called for Eris, who was sitting next to Skoll, stroking the large wolf with a bored expression. Upon seeing Rigger and Ghislaine, she quickly stood up. "Let's go to the house where I'm staying," Rigger said, leading the way. Rigger arrived at his house with Ghislaine and Eris, quickly organizing the space to accommodate them. He requested 2 extra beds from the dwarves and calmly declared, "You can sleep here tonight. It's been a while since you 2 slept in a decent place. Tomorrow morning, we'll head to Brightstone Cavern to pick up my sword and then travel quickly to catch up to Laws. I don't know if you'll want to join the feast, but you're invited." Eris, upon hearing this, exclaimed excitedly, "Finally!" and threw herself onto the bed. Rigger glanced at Ghislaine, waiting for a response, but she only started exploring the room. He then left the house to immerse himself in preparations for the feast. During the organization, Rigger participated actively, speaking with the dwarves who had volunteered or been chosen to join the Iron Legion. He discussed the route they would follow and other logistical details, while also helping with food preparation and table arrangements. Once everything was ready, the feast began. The party was lively. Dragon meat was the main dish, and the dwarves praised Rigger for the feat of bringing such a rare item to the feast. Despite his initial worries, the meat turned out to be delicious. The previous issue when he ate dragon meat was simply due to his extremely poor cooking skills. He drank quite a lot with Godbard and the hosts, knowing he could use detoxification later. The hall buzzed with laughter, stories, and toasts. The dwarves were eager to hear more about the battles against the blue dragons, and Rigger recounted the intense fights in detail. His storytelling, combined with his ability to captivate the audience, further increased the dwarves' respect for him. Among the listeners, some were particularly excited about the idea of joining the Iron Legion, impressed by Rigger's strength and skill. After hours of celebration, Rigger bid farewell to the dwarves and returned to the temporary house. Upon entering, he found Eris sleeping soundly in one of the beds. Ghislaine, on the other hand, was sitting in a chair with her eyes closed. As soon as he opened the door, she opened one eye, demonstrating her alertness. Rigger greeted her in a casual tone. "You're not going to sleep on the bed?" He looked at her from head to toe, once again admiring her impressive physique. He began to feel a bit flustered, but restrained himself. Ghislaine noticed the look but remained indifferent, likely used to such reactions. She responded in a serious tone, "I need to be ready to protect Eris if something happens." Rigger nodded, attempting to reassure her, "I know you haven't known me for long, but as long as I'm here, nothing will happen. I guarantee it." With those words, he turned to the room, conjuring magical barriers around the house. "These barriers will alert me if anything tries to destroy them, but the chances are almost zero," he concluded, turning back to face her directly. The two locked eyes for a moment. Ghislaine seemed to be assessing Rigger, while he struggled to maintain his composure, admiring her commanding presence. Finally, she stood up and said, "All right. Thank you." Without further words, Ghislaine lay down on one of the beds. In less than 10 seconds, her rhythmic breathing indicated she had already fallen deeply asleep. Rigger was impressed. "Wow, she falls asleep fast," he murmured to himself, smiling. He observed her for a moment before heading to his own bed, lying down as his mind wandered. He thought about Tinaver and the current state of the Legion. He reflected on his parents and friends in the Great Forest, and finally, his master. The image of the golden-haired, blue-eyed elf appeared in his mind, bringing a small, involuntary smile to his lips. But it wasn't long before Ghislaine also returned to his thoughts. Their personalities and appearances were completely different, yet both attracted him in intense ways. He found himself pondering how fortunate it was that the Beast Tribe's mating season had recently ended. What would have happened if I had met her during that time? He thought. I'll need to control myself next year. With these reflections, he allowed exhaustion to take over, falling asleep as he mentally prepared for the next day. The rising sun painted the sky with shades of orange at dawn as the dwarven delegation bid farewell to Rigger. Godbard extended his hand to Rigger, who shook it firmly. I truly believe that your Iron Legion will be a new starting point for a great change in the lives of dwarves and many other races. I wish you luck and wisdom on your path. Rigger smiled. Of all the places I've been, I haven't found another people who throw a party as lively as the dwarves. The dwarves laughed in unison, exchanging knowing glances. Rigger laughed too, because it was true. Dwarven celebrations were unique. Perhaps it was their lack of inhibition about almost everything, or the way they celebrated each moment with intensity. Either way, he had enjoyed the experience. Godbard turned to Ghislaine and Eris. I wish you both luck on your journey home. The caravan carrying the half-elf shouldn't be far now. Then, he looked at Eris with a challenging smile. And you, little girl, you better not disappoint me. Use that sword well. Eris blinked, confused. Huh? What sword? Godbard only laughed before walking away with the other dwarves. Eris looked at Ghislaine and then at Rigger, who pulled a sheathed sword from his waist and held it out to her. The scabbard was brown leather with silver detailing. The hilt was large, and the guard was subtle but decorated with discreet adornments forming the fangs of a feline. It was a long sword, reasonably big for someone her age. "I bought this sword for you. Godbard made it a few years ago," Rigger said. "You have great talent with a sword, and I've seen your dedication to training, so obviously, you need a proper weapon. Your fighting style is aggressive, so I thought a longsword would suit you best." Eris took the sword, still stunned. Rigger continued, "It has the ability to become lighter in the hands of its wielder, so the weight won't be a problem for you, even though you're still small." The girl was speechless, staring at the sword as if she still couldn't believe what she had just received. Rigger was amused by her surprised expression, but didn't wait for a response. "All right, now let's go get my sword." Before Eris could react, Skoll dashed ahead, barking excitedly. Ghislaine followed closely behind, but a faint smile could be seen on her face. Eris, still holding her new sword, took a second to realize she was being left behind. Wait. Did you just call me small?" She ran after them, gripping her new weapon, unsure whether to smile or protest. Deep down, though, she felt something new and exciting, a feeling she didn't quite understand. When they arrived at Brightstone's cave once again, Eris walked with a gleam in her eyes. She strode ahead, a bright smile on her face. She now carried her sword on her back. Her clothes had changed as well. During their visit to the Dwarven city, Rigger had bought her a reinforced leather outfit and a black cloak that swayed gently in the wind. The girl seemed very pleased with her new appearance. Ghislaine, on the other hand, had also changed her attire, though the difference was subtle. Her style was already minimalistic and revealed a lot of skin, so her new clothes simply replaced the tattered rags she had been wearing before. At least now she looked more presentable, at least as much as one could while still half naked. At the very least, both of them had gotten rid of the dirty, burned, and torn clothes they had worn when they were found. As soon as they reached the cave entrance, Eris excitedly jumped into an open space near the cliff and shouted, "Ghislaine, let's train." Before even getting a response, she was already wielding her new sword, repeating the movements of the sword god style. Her eyes shone with determination, and her stance reflected years of training. According to Ghislaine, she had already reached the intermediate level and was now striving to master advanced techniques. The master, without hesitation, followed her apprentice, crossing her arms as she observed her strikes. Rigger looked at Skoll and ordered, "Stay close and keep watch." The wolf let out a soft growl of acknowledgement and sat down, remaining vigilant. With that settled, Rigger turned toward the cave and stepped inside. The moment he crossed the entrance, he felt something different. The air was thick with an intense presence of mana, a wild and heated energy pulsing from deep within the cave. His magic eye detected waves of power flowing like an underground river, all converging at a single point. This wasn't here last time. His heart quickened slightly, and he moved forward until he reached the large iron door. Without hesitation, he knocked firmly. "It's me," he announced. It took no more than 5 seconds before footsteps echoed from the other side. The door opened, revealing Brightstone, who wore a wide grin and an expression of pure excitement. He was actually carrying travel bags. "You're really lucky, kid." The dwarf laughed mischievously, crossing his arms. "This sword of yours is definitely the masterpiece of my entire life. The pinnacle of my methods. I'm sure I've never made anything this powerful." Rigger raised an eyebrow, intrigued, and stepped into the forge. To his surprise, the place was impeccably organized. Unlike last time, when tools and materials were scattered everywhere, the workshop now looked empty, clean, and tidy. "You cleaned up the forge?" he asked. Brightstone let out another laugh and shook his head. "No, I'm moving. I'm heading to Azura to start working for them." "Azura?" Rigger repeated, frowning. "Yes. After enchanting your blade with an S-rank magic stone, I discovered a new method, one that only works with stones that have a high mana concentration. I finally found the path to push my craft even further." The dwarf's eyes gleamed with ambition. I got an invitation from them a while ago after being expelled from the Dwarven city for befriending a noble from there. I believe only the great Azura Kingdom can support the costs of this research. Only S-rank magic stones? Who else would be willing to pay for that? Hee. But this will be an innovation for the entire world. Rigger was slightly surprised. All the other dwarves had described him as an eccentric on the brink of ruin, a reckless fool. But now, standing before him, was a revitalized man overflowing with determination. He murmured, "Azura Kingdom, huh?" Brightstone laughed again and walked forward, striding through the cave with energy. "And you will be my advertisement. I expect you to use your sword well, achieve great feats, so I can use that as leverage when I negotiate my position." Rigger remained silent, pondering. Then, his eyes turned to the blade resting on a stone table. Tsukikage. Surprisingly, there was nothing different about it. It didn't have the various embedded magic stones anywhere on the blade or hilt, which struck him as odd. However, upon focusing his magic eye, he immediately noticed the immense concentration of mana he had felt earlier was now residing within the blade itself. He slowly approached, extending his hand toward the grip. The instant his fingers touched the hilt, a deep roar echoed in his mind. A dragon's roar, not physical, but reverberating within his soul. On the outside, the sword looked the same as before, but when Rigger tried to engulf the blade in flames, he was caught off guard by an explosion of fire, intense and wild. The flames roared upward, illuminating the entire cave with an orange and golden glow. "Ah, you idiot!" Brightstone shouted as he threw himself behind a stone pillar. The initial shock made Rigger tighten his grip on the hilt, and he quickly controlled the flames, dissipating them. He took a deep breath, trying to understand what had just happened. Then, he realized something absurd. The efficiency of his fire magic had increased ninefold, almost 10. The same power that previously required a large amount of mana now consumed 9 times less. His eyes widened. What method did he use? And why isn't the magic stone visible? Brightstone stepped out from behind the pillar, now laughing loudly. Ha. You lucky bastard. You're fortunate that I told you I wouldn't charge anything if you brought me the mutant dragon's magic stone. Because this sword isn't something money can buy. The dwarf crossed his arms, satisfied. I know your previous ability was retained, but I'm almost certain there's a new one as well. I just don't know what it is yet. Rigger continued staring at the blade, feeling the pulsing power within it. This sword. Brightstone then grabbed a packed backpack and walked toward the cave's exit. "Well, if there's nothing else, I'm taking my leave," he announced. And with that, the dwarf departed, leaving Rigger alone with Tsukikage, the blade that would change his destiny forever. Rigger observed Tsukikage as he reflected on his new acquisition. Fire magic should be the most amplified, considering it came from a dragon, followed by earth and wind, or perhaps the other way around. He frowned, twirling the sword in his hand. "This is incredible. I need to conduct more tests to confirm this weapon's full potential." The thought excited him. If the blade truly possessed this level of amplification, it could drastically change his approach to combat. His eyes turned to Brightstone, who was already walking away. Should I invite him to the Legion? Aside from himself, there was no one in the Iron Legion capable of consistently hunting Srank beasts. And Rigger would soon be leaving for the Sword Sanctuary. If he wanted to do this, he would need to intensify the training of the members before his departure, creating at least 2 combat groups capable of hunting these monsters. Even so, having someone like Brightstone could change the entire power structure if he could replicate these enchantments consistently. His method was mysterious, but it would strengthen the foundation while Rigger was away. Rigger pondered for a moment before sheathing Tsukikage and fastening it to his waist, now carrying 2 magic swords. Neither Godbard nor Brightstone fully understood the abilities of their creations. Even he didn't yet comprehend the true potential of both blades. But one thing was certain, his strength had increased significantly. Without further hesitation, he hurried to catch up with Brightstone, intercepting him along the path. Ghislaine and Eris were training on a nearby cliff, and the sound of blades echoed through the air. Brightstone raised an eyebrow upon noticing his approach. "What is it, kid?" the dwarf asked, crossing his arms. Rigger kept a serious expression. "Join the Iron Legion." Brightstone blinked, visibly surprised. "What's the Iron Legion?" Rigger almost choked on his response before letting out a sigh and forcing a smile. "It's the organization I created. I want you to join us." The dwarf scratched his beard, pondering for a moment. "Humph. Interesting." A calculating glint crossed his eyes. He thought for a minute, looked around, and said, "Okay. As of today, I'm part of the Iron Legion. But know that my research will be expensive. You already understand what this sword can do, so be prepared to invest. Also, I want a certain level of freedom in the organization. I don't want anyone giving me orders except the leader." Rigger raised his eyebrows. He accepted way too quickly. I really expected to have to convince him. Brightstone chuckled and started walking again. "Besides, I'll need some assistance, which I'll choose once I get there." Rigger stood still for a moment, stunned. This guy really had confidence in himself. But in the end, it made sense. Brightstone understood the value of his services even more than Rigger did, and he knew he could demand practically anything. The dwarf waved without looking back. "I'm not going with you now. I still have belongings in the Dwarven City. I heard from Fort Wind that some dwarves will be joining the Legion as well, so I'll travel with them. I'll meet you at your headquarters." And with that, without further explanations, he went on his way. Rigger was pleased. If he could use these weapons to equip at least his top fighters, it would already be a huge gain. It would also be a way to attract new members and motivate them through rewards. He really thinks highly of me, choosing to join the Iron Legion instead of the Azura Kingdom. He must truly believe in my talent. Little did Rigger know that Brightstone had misunderstood some things. The dwarf assumed that Rigger was extremely confident in his proposal, first testing the sword's quality before making an invitation. He also believed that Ghislaine was part of the Legion, Rigger and a Sword King together? This organization must be nearly as strong as Azura, right? This was a fortunate coincidence for Rigger, who remained unaware of the dwarf's true reasoning. Brightstone was likely in for a surprise upon arriving in Tinaver. Rigger let out a long sigh and shook his head before turning to Ghislaine and Eris. He walked up to them and stopped nearby, observing their intense movements. "Eris," he called, "you'll be riding Skull." The girl halted mid-swing, her eyes widening. Her expression of surprise instantly transformed into pure joy. "Really?" She ran to Skull, stroking the large wolf, which wagged its tail. Rigger gave a faint smile at her excitement before turning to Ghislaine. "Ghislaine, we'll have to pick up the pace to catch up with that caravan. The road isn't safe all the way there. We need to get there as quickly as possible if you want to find the elf from Fitoa." Ghislaine remained silent for a moment, contemplating. Then, she nodded with determination. "All right." And so, without further delay, they set off, leaving behind the Blue Dragon Mountain Range and the Dwarven City, heading toward Tinaver. POV, Laws. The battlefield was a pandemonium of slicing wings and devouring jaws. A cloud of locusts spread through the air like a living plague, a swarm of hundreds of giant insects, each the size of a hunting hound, resonating in an infernal cacophony. The deafening buzzing transformed into an incessant vibration in the chests of the dwarven warriors fighting for their lives. The ground was covered in mutilated bodies and blood, both from dwarves and the insects themselves. Dented shields, broken axes, screams of pain and despair filled the apocalyptic scene. The dwarven caravan, now reduced to half its original size, held firm in a defensive circle, desperate to resist until the horde passed. Hold the formation. The horde must be close to passing. Do not retreat. Anyone who separates from the group is as good as dead, roared the dwarven leader, his hoarse voice cutting through the chaos. Among the dwarven warriors, a blonde half-elf moved with deadly precision. Laws, with the refined eyes of a hunter, positioned himself strategically behind an overturned carriage. Each arrow he fired a precise strike, saving lives at the last moment. His fingers were slick with sweat and blood. A deep bite from a locust throbbed on his shoulder, but he did not stop. He could not stop. Every second counted. Damn it! What rotten luck. Could Sylphie or Lyaina be nearby? I thought, gritting my teeth as I pulled another arrow and pierced the head of a locust preparing to crush a young dwarf. The boy looked at me with wide eyes, filled with fear and gratitude, before returning to the fight. The battle seemed endless, a never-ending nightmare, until the wind changed. At first, it was just a strong gust, enough to make the insect's wings vibrate erratically. Then, the first locusts began to be lifted off the ground. Some tried to resist, their legs gripping onto rocks' bodies, anything to keep them anchored, but the force of the wind was overwhelming. A whirlwind began to form around the caravan, and soon it became evident what was happening. A colossal tornado spun around them but did not touch them directly. It was as if an invisible barrier protected them while the fury of the storm devoured their enemies. The sky, once darkened by the swarm of insects, began to clear. Amid the whirlwinds of dust and blood, Laws saw a figure atop a hill. A beast woman stood with her arms crossed, observing the scene below, while a red-haired girl stood at her side. But it was the third figure that truly made Laws hold his breath, gripping a shining blue sword pointed at the hurricane. Amid the chaotic sky, a young warrior of the beast race hovered in the air, manipulating the natural disaster with surgical precision. His face was expressionless, eyes refined like those of a predator coldly analyzing the fate of his prey. His hands moved lightly, like a conductor guiding an orchestra of destruction. POV, Rigger observed the scene below with calculated attention. The caravan group was alive, though reduced and wounded. He had decided to come early as a precaution, but he would never have predicted a locust horde attacking at such a scale. The chances of such an event happening were incredibly low. Those dwarves and Laws were truly unlucky. His eyes analyzed the insect storm, now spinning faster and faster within the tornado. Their jaws clicked, shrill cries mixed with the howling wind. It was almost a symphony of chaos. But it still wasn't enough. Raising Tsukikage, his blue sword, Rigger began gathering more mana. The blade of the sword glowed faintly, and then small wind blades appeared around him, dancing and spinning like death's heralds for his prey. He waited for a moment, feeling the storm reach its peak. Then, in a single fluid motion, he swung his sword in a horizontal arc. Saint-level original spell, Tempest of Wind Blades. The initial cut was silent, but a second later dozens, perhaps hundreds of blades spread from the strike, slicing through everything inside the tornado. Each wind blade cut through the locusts' bodies like a scythe harvesting wheat. The swarm was ruthlessly massacred, and the sound of cutting filled the air, accompanied by the agonized screeches of the insects being torn apart. Dark blood rained from the sky. The mutilated bodies of the locusts fell like dead leaves, staining the ground crimson. Rigger slowly dissipated the tornado, leaving only a trail of destruction behind. The forest was silent. The surviving dwarven warriors stood frozen, eyes wide at the apocalyptic spectacle they had just witnessed. Laws lowered his bow, breathing heavily, staring at the young beastman in the sky with disbelief. High above, Rigger landed smoothly on the hill where Ghislaine and Eris waited for him. That was much easier than before. A small redhead bounced excitedly, her eyes shining with admiration. "Rigger, teach me magic." Rigger sighed, observing Eris with a mix of exasperation and amusement. I already knew she wanted to learn, but she never asked, and why would I offer out of nowhere? I gave plenty of chances. But after seeing large-scale magic, she finally couldn't hold back, huh? He looked at the young redhead in front of him, who crossed her arms with a determined expression, a slight blush still on her cheeks. Unfazed by the girl's pride, Rigger nodded slightly and replied, "I can teach you, just say please." Before she could respond, he turned to Ghislaine, adding, "Actually, I can teach both of you. Some spells are extremely useful, even if you can only use the elemental form. But it requires patience, and above all, you need to know how to read and write. Are you willing?" Eris, who had looked eager until that moment, immediately hesitated, as if reading and writing were some kind of dark curse. Her sour expression gave everything away. Ghislaine, on the other hand, surprised Rigger by responding without hesitation. "I would like to learn to read and write. Actually, even math. But do you think I can learn?" Rigger raised an eyebrow, looking at her for a moment before smiling slightly. Of course you can. It's never too late to learn something. As long as you have an open mind and diligence, almost anything can be learned. He then turned toward the remaining caravan, leaving the conversation behind as he moved with quick steps. When he reached the survivors, he immediately began casting healing spells, treating the wounded with efficiency and precision. The members of the caravan looked at him with respect and admiration. The group's leader stepped forward with a tired but sincere smile. Thank you. Rigger, right? I will be eternally grateful. Perhaps this would have been our end if you hadn't arrived. Ha ha ha. It's a shame that so many of ours had to fall before your arrival. Rigger kept a neutral expression and responded naturally, Don't worry about it. The Iron Legion is already allied with the dwarves. Of course I would help. But... He then turned toward a man with half-elven features, pale skin, and short blonde hair. His refined eyes were akin to those of a seasoned hunter. You there, the half-elf. Your name is Laws. The half-elf blinked, confused by the sudden approach. Huh? Yes, my name is Laws. Do I know you? Rigger chuckled, crossing his arms. I don't think so, but I ask that you come with me. Without further explanation, he turned away, leaving a perplexed Laws behind. The half-elf hesitated for a moment before following Rigger, feeling that he owed that much to his savior. As they walked, Ghislaine and Eris approached. Eris, in a dramatic manner, crossed her arms and declared, All right. I'll learn to read, write, and do math in exchange for you teaching me magic. Please. Rigger blinked a few times, surprised by her sudden change of heart. His eyes slid to Ghislaine, silently pondering what she might have done to convince Eris. However, he decided to push that thought to the back of his mind for now. As he approached Laws, he gave a brief introduction. Supposedly, this is Laws from Buena Village in Fitoa. Laws turned to Ghislaine, studying her for a moment before furrowing his brow in recognition. You are Ghislaine de Doldia? Were you teleported as well? Ghislaine blinked, confused. Do we know each other? Laws let out a light chuckle and shook his head. Not really. But I saw you once when I was in Roa with Lord Philip Boreas Greyrat. I recognized you. Where were you when it all happened? Ghislaine's expression grew serious. In Roa. At the Lord's mansion. Law's eyes widened before his brows furrowed deeply. That means, all of Fitoa was affected? He was shocked, absorbing the implications of this information. It took him a few seconds to compose himself before asking urgently, All right, did you see a little elf girl with green hair? Or a beast woman like you on your way? Ghislaine shook her head in denial. Laws lowered his gaze, visibly dejected. Eris, who had remained silent until now, suddenly seemed restless. Her gaze shifted between Ghislaine and Laws, tension clearly written on her face. Ghislaine, noticing her hesitation, asked the question that haunted her as well. Did you see Lord Sorrows? Or any other member of the Boreas Greyrat family? Laws hesitated before letting out a heavy sigh. No, I didn't see any of them. But I did see a man's corpse a few kilometers from where I appeared. He had already been partially devoured by wolves. I don't know who he was. They then discussed the details of the incident, sharing what they knew. Rigger listened attentively, trying to piece together the mystery behind this event. Finally, he turned to Laws and spoke seriously. Laws, I am the leader of an organization called the Iron Legion in Millis. Given the scale of this incident, searching for your wife and daughter alone would be unproductive. The most likely fate of those who appeared in unknown places is either starving to death or becoming slaves. He paused for a moment to let him absorb his words. I saw that you're skilled with a bow, so you must have been a hunter. When I return, I intend to form a group within the Iron Legion to search for the missing. Of course, the rescued individuals would have to join the Iron Legion, either temporarily or permanently, and I'd like you to lead this group provisionally. Do you accept? Laws remained silent for a moment, processing the proposal. Finally, he slowly nodded. You're right. He then bowed deeply. I accept, and thank you very much for your help. Rigger shrugged. Don't worry about it. I have my own interests in helping as well. Even so, Laws maintained his bow. Still, I believe this action will save many lives. Rigger simply nodded before turning to Ghislaine and Eris. Do you agree to travel with the caravan? Ghislaine shrugged. I don't see a problem. Eris was silent, a really rare thing. And so, the group joined the caravan, continuing their journey toward Tinavur. Eris Boreas Greyrat positioned herself in an improvised arena. The compacted dirt and stones had been shaped with magic to create a combat space, a small circle marked by raised earth. Around it, a group of dwarves watched with great interest, exchanging bets and animated comments about the duel's outcome. On the other side of the arena, a burly dwarven warrior held his axe firmly, his gaze determined as he faced his young opponent. Eris advanced without hesitation. Her low, aggressive stance, characteristic of the sword god style, indicated she was about to attack with ferocity. The dwarf grinned, clearly pleased with the challenge, and raised his weapon in preparation. As the fight began, Eris moved swiftly. Her first strike was a fast horizontal slash, forcing the dwarf to step back and block with his axe handle. But she didn't stop there. Spinning on her heels, she launched an upward slash, forcing her opponent to take another step back. The dwarven warrior tried to respond with heavy swings, but Eris was simply too fast. She circled around him, her precise attacks seeking openings in his defense. With each passing moment, her advantage grew. The spectators began murmuring excitedly. Finally, with a fluid and fierce movement, Eris slid inside the dwarf's reach, dodging a downward axe strike, and struck her opponent on the side of his armor with enough force to bring him to his knee. The dwarf gasped for air and raised a hand in surrender. The dwarves erupted into applause and cheers, clinking their beer mugs together and praising the young warrior's skill. Eris, sweaty and panting, raised her sword, satisfied with herself, but soon her gaze drifted to the tent nearby. Inside, Rigger sat beside Ghislaine de Doldia, holding a letter in front of her. These letters together form the word sword, Rigger explained, pointing to the characters on the sheet of paper. Ghislaine, brows furrowed and eyes fixed on the paper, murmured the word softly, tracing the strokes in the air with her fingers. Her concentration was so intense that she didn't notice Eris had won the match. The young redhead then shifted her gaze to Rigger, who smiled and casually praised her. Well done, Eris. She immediately turned her head to the side and huffed, naturally, as if his approval meant nothing. But Rigger just chuckled softly, returning his attention to Ghislaine, who continued practicing the characters. The days passed, and the journey continued with few incidents. Occasional attacks from wild beasts occurred, but nothing posed a real challenge. With Rigger and Ghislaine protecting the caravan, any enemy seemed ridiculously weak. Initially, Rigger intended to teach magic and basic studies only when they returned to the Iron Legion, but his plans changed the very same day he suggested the idea. Ghislaine appeared at night, holding a notebook borrowed from one of the merchants. I'm ready to start the lesson, she said seriously. Rigger blinked a few times before shrugging. He wasn't going to refuse her now that she was already here. Very well. Let's begin. And so, the days became a routine of learning. He taught Ghislaine and Eris how to read, write, and even basic mathematics. Although she struggled at first, Ghislaine's dedication was impressive. Eris, on the other hand, only agreed to learn after Rigger asked Ghislaine to convince her, which she did by telling various stories of her time as a solo adventurer, stories Rigger was also interested in hearing. Additionally, he taught them elemental magic. His initial focus was on fire, water, and healing, as they were the easiest to apply. If they showed enough progress, he would expand the lessons. When he wasn't teaching, he trained personally with Ghislaine, testing different combat styles. Eris, even though she was already adept in the sword god style, absorbed some of his instructions, though she would never admit it directly. In his free time, Rigger also hunted with Laws, the half-elf from Fatoa. He recalled how hunting had been fun when he was younger, but as he grew stronger, the activity lost its challenge. Even so, he enjoyed observing Laws in action, learning his stealth techniques and his incredible precision with a bow. The days turned into weeks, and the caravan finally approached Tinaver. Soon, the horizon would be dominated by the city's towering walls and white spires. With their destination in sight, everyone's journey was about to take a new step forward. Rigger watched Eris, who was gripping a piece of charcoal between her fingers with unnecessary force, nearly crushing the small object against the parchment surface. She bit her lower lip, her crimson eyes half closed, trying to force her brain to solve the calculations he had given her to test her progress. "Ha! This is impossible!" Eris exclaimed, throwing the charcoal to the ground and crossing her arms. Rigger chuckled slightly, picking up the charcoal and placing it back in her hand. "It's not impossible. It's like training with a sword. The more you repeat, the better you get. Try again. Think through each step calmly." She growled but turned back to the parchment, determined to solve the problem. It was then that Rigger turned, sensing something. Tinaver was finally appearing on the horizon, its stone and wooden structures forming a familiar silhouette against the blue sky. He narrowed his eyes, adjusting his focus, and instinctively expanded his senses. First, he tried to catch the sounds of the city. His smile faded. Wasn't the city quieter than it should be? Something was wrong. He frowned, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling creeping up his spine. He took a deep breath and inhaled, trying to catch the scents carried by the wind. And then his feeling intensified. The scent of blood. A chill ran through his skin. His jaw tightened. "I hope it's just a group of bandits," he thought, trying to suppress the growing sense that it wasn't something so simple. The scent was coming from the direction of the Iron Legion's base. His instincts screamed a warning. Something was very, very wrong. He stood up quickly. "Ghislaine, I'm going ahead. I have a bad feeling." His voice was firm, leaving no room for discussion. Ghislaine, who was holding a book in the cart beside him, turned, her feline eyes gleaming with alertness. But before she could say anything, he had already taken off. The surroundings blurred. He ran like lightning, his legs moving in explosive bursts of speed. The wind lashed against his face, the city's sounds growing louder as he approached. But something was strange. Tinaver seemed different. The atmosphere was heavy, as if a veil of tension hung over everything. He leaped over rooftops, slid through alleys, ignoring the confused looks of the few citizens crossing his path. The scent of blood grew stronger. Then he saw it. The Iron Legion's base. Or rather, what was left of it. The main entrance was destroyed, rubble scattered across the street. The outer walls were marked with deep cuts and magical burn marks. Parts of the second floor had collapsed, revealing devastated rooms. It was the scene of an intense battle. What the hell happened here? His rage grew, his heartbeat accelerating. He activated his magic eye, expanding his perception to track any nearby mana signatures. Energy flowed through his body, and he detected a signal inside the ruined structure. Without hesitation, he rushed inside. Weaving through the debris, he arrived at a partially destroyed room. The ceiling was cracked, allowing daylight to stream through the gaps in the wooden beams. In the center of the room, a woman was tending to an injured man, cleaning the deep cuts on his arm. Rigger entered abruptly, his voice heavy with urgency and fury. "What happened here?" The woman startled, nearly dropping the blood-soaked cloth. But before she could respond, the injured man moved. His eyes widened at the sight of Rigger, and he forced himself to sit up despite his pain. It was Joseph, the former slave Rigger had rescued. A former mercenary and one of the Iron Legion's most dedicated members. His face was pale, covered in sweat, but a relieved smile formed. "Boss, it's good that you're back." Rigger approached without hesitation, raising his hand and casting advanced healing magic. Golden energy coursed through Joseph's body, sealing his wounds in an instant. The man let out a heavy sigh, his expression visibly improving. "Boss, we need to act quick. What happened while I was gone?" Rigger interrupted, his voice tense. He needed to know. Now. Joseph hesitated. The silence that followed was heavy. The man looked away as if trying to avoid Rigger's gaze. But there was no choice. He took a deep breath and began speaking. Joseph inhaled deeply, his face still pale from blood loss, but his voice carried urgency and tension as he started recounting the events. Rigger remained silent, every muscle in his body tense, listening to each word as if they were being etched into his mind with iron. A few days ago, Pycak discovered that the Joylore House was also investigating us, and that they had already gathered far more information about us than we had imagined. Until then, everything was going well. Trade was thriving, new members were joining every day, and Taze was an impenetrable shield, taking down any strong opponent that appeared, ensuring that we suffered few casualties. Joseph paused, his gaze momentarily shifting to the ground. Rigger noticed his trembling fists. Joseph swallowed hard and continued, but then, one day, a group of Mealy's Holy Knights ambushed and killed some of our members in Tenever's northern district. It was brutal. No warning, no negotiations. They just massacred our people. Taze didn't hesitate. He took several of us, including me, to confront them. We wanted answers. We wanted to understand why we were being attacked like this, but... Joseph gritted his teeth, his face contorted with guilt and rage. It was a trap. Rigger didn't blink. His gaze was locked onto Joseph, the words echoing in his mind like war drums. A troop of holy knights loyal to House Joylore surrounded us, and among them were 3 saint-level swordsmen, 2 from the Water God style and 1 from the North God style. They accused us of conspiring with the assassin Verdia Solarion, and accused you of terrorist and genocidal acts. He exhaled heavily. At first, they tried to lure us in. After a while, we could clearly see that they were waiting for you, the Red Wolf. They played with time, measuring our strength. The more Rigger listened to Joseph, the worse his thoughts became. The most terrible possibilities ran through his mind. Joseph continued, but Taze noticed your delay, and before they could act, he used chantless magic to ambush them and severely wounded one of them. That enraged them. They lost patience and decided to capture the Legion's members to force your arrival. No matter what we did, they were determined to drag you into this fight. When Taze realized the battle was lost, he called 4 more warriors and held them back so the rest of us could escape, including me. Rigger felt a wave of heat rise through his body. His breathing grew heavy. The air felt dense, as if the very atmosphere around him was being distorted. That was 2 days ago. After that, some holy knights came here to the base. Joseph's words started to lose meaning for him. A dull ringing grew in his ears, drowning out any other sound. The world around him began to lose its color, turning into shades of red and black. His chest rose and fell too fast. Each beat of his heart felt like a war drum being struck with brutal force. His eyes wandered, but they no longer saw the destroyed base. They didn't see Joseph standing before him. In his mind, images appeared, Taze, Kidder, and the others, wounded, chained, possibly tortured. Their blood staining the ground. Their screams silenced by merciless blades. The cold smiles of the Joylore House Knights as they destroyed everything he had built. Everything he had created with the goal of bringing real change to this world. Guilt coiled in his stomach like sharp claws. Where was he while this was happening? Enjoying himself. Traveling with Ghislaine and Eris, laughing without a care. Feasting with Godbard and the dwarves, eating dragon meat joyfully. He wasn't here. He wasn't here when they needed him. He had been warned about this, that Mealy's would go after subordinates, friends, and family when they couldn't deal with someone directly. And yet, he had traveled far away. His hands began to tremble. The air around him seemed to vibrate. Joseph kept talking, mentioning strategies and countermeasures, something about seeking the Pope's faction for help and that most of the situation had already been resolved. But Rigger wasn't listening anymore. Something inside him snapped. His breathing turned into a growl. His body burned, not with heat, but with the uncontrollable fury growing within him. Every fiber of his being screamed for blood. His vision blurred for an instant, then everything became clear in a different way. His beastly instincts decided that the best course of action was to protect his own. There was no logic anymore. No strategy. Only the brutal, inescapable truth. His pack was being hunted. And now, he would hunt them back. Joseph was still talking, his voice becoming a distant echo in Rigger's mind. The world around him felt murky, as if he were underwater, but one sound pierced through the haze, the erratic beating of his own heart, accelerating with every word spoken. Guilt bit deeper than any blade. He had been traveling, laughing, enjoying Ghislaine and Eris's company, while his friends were here, being hunted, captured, maybe even killed because of him. His fingers clenched so tightly that his claws tore into the flesh of his palm, but he didn't notice the pain. His chest rose and fell with ragged breaths, his eyes fixed on nothing, his thoughts spiraling into a storm of growing rage. The room around him felt stifling, as if the very air was bowing under the presence of something monstrous. A deep growl rumbled from his throat, dense and primal, making the wood and debris around him vibrate slightly. Joseph took a step back, alarmed. "Boss, calm down. We already have a plan. We can fix this." His voice was firm but carried hesitation, a justified fear. The woman tending to Joseph was pressed against the wall, eyes wide, body tense, like a deer facing a predator. But Rigger no longer heard them. He was pure instinct now. In an explosive movement, he launched himself at the mansion wall, tearing through it as if it were paper. Wood and debris flew in all directions as he emerged from the wreckage, his eyes blazing with an intense golden glow, predatory. His entire body radiated chaotic energy, as if he were about to explode. And then, at the destroyed entrance of the Legion, he saw Ghislaine and Eris. The young girl was mounted on Skoll, her eyes wide, not understanding what was happening but sensing the danger in the air. Ghislaine, however, understood. The moment she looked at Rigger, her instincts screamed in warning. She rested a hand on her sword hilt, her muscles tensing. "Rigger, calm down. What happened?" Her voice was firm but controlled, as if she were speaking to a beast about to attack. He didn't respond. He didn't even look at her. Instead, he leaned forward and pressed both hands against the ground, his claws digging into the earth. The world around him disappeared as he inhaled deeply, scenting. Every smell in the city, every speck of dust, every trace of blood mixed in the air formed a three-dimensional map in his mind. He was tracking, searching. His muscles were taut like an animal on the verge of striking. His furry tail swayed slowly, his ears alert. And then, he found it. A familiar scent, mixed with sweat and metal. Hitter. A new growl rumbled from his throat, but this time, the sound expanded, carrying magic instinctively. Howling magic. The air vibrated, an invisible pressure wave spread out, making the glass around him crackle. Ghislaine frowned. Before anyone could react, Rigger shot forward. His body moved in a blur, running on all fours, his muscles exploding with brutal speed. Each leap, each stride, made the ground crack slightly under the force of his movements. He wasn't thinking logically anymore. At this moment, he was no longer a warrior. He was a beast. POV, Ghislaine de Doldia. I hadn't really believed him when he said he also had savage outbursts. I thought he was exaggerating, that he had more control than he imagined. But now I understood. What I saw there wasn't a reckless warrior. It was a predator in its purest state. Something I had only seen a few times in my life. Rigger, in particular, looked like a wounded wolf, desperate to kill whoever was harming his pack. My instincts told me not to cross his path. But I couldn't let this happen. Compared to my childhood, his case was much worse. Could he return from this on his own? I wouldn't risk it. I owed him a life debt. I looked at Eris, who was frozen on Skoll's back. Her expression shifted between shock and confusion, and the wolf looked afraid. "Eris, stay with Skoll," I said firmly. "Tell them you came with Rigger, but don't leave Skoll's side. Understand?" She nodded, grasping the gravity of the situation. Then I pushed myself forward, running in the direction Rigger had gone. My mind worked quickly. I knew he wasn't in a state to think rationally. I didn't know if he wanted me to stop him or if he just wanted blood. But if he was in this state, he probably wouldn't use all his strength properly. I needed to be there before it was too late. POV, Gorfolt Linstar Gorfolt, the chief of Knights of House Joylor, remained motionless on the stone wall of the estate, his eyes fixed on the horizon stretching beyond the plains. The cutting night wind shook the house's golden banners, while torches scattered across the courtyard illuminated the warriors on patrol. The grand noble residence of the Joylor family, located outside the limits of Malaysian, maintained considerable autonomy, a reflection of the power and influence its lineage had cultivated over the decades. The alliance with the Cardinal faction, the faction advocating for the expulsion of demonic races, guaranteed House Joylor privileges and political security. However, in recent years, this stability had been eroded by the growing restlessness of its leader. Linstar Joylor was consumed by fear and obsession. The Knight Commander saw it clearly. The man who once ruled with unquestionable authority was now sinking into paranoia and insomnia, plagued by recurring nightmares. The origin of his torment traced back to 4 years ago, when he had hired a North Saint, a renowned assassin named Kalinowski. The mission was simple: eliminate the last surviving assassin responsible for his parents' deaths. Everything was planned. Linstar had conducted thorough investigations and was certain that the target would return to help her tribe in a time of need, and a North Saint should have been able to kill her with relative ease. But the plan failed catastrophically. Not only did Kalinowski fail to complete his task, but he also met a humiliating death. Rumors claimed that the one responsible for this turn of events was merely a 6-year-old beast child, aided by Verdia Solarion, the true target of the attack. The Knight Commander vividly recalled the impact of this news on Linstar. He had refused to believe it, roaring in rage and disbelief in the main hall. The idea that a brat barely out of infancy had overcome a North Saint seemed absurd, an affront to logic. But the survivors' reports were consistent. With each messenger bringing new information about the child, Linstar's expression grew darker, his eyes carrying a silent fury that threatened to explode at any moment. Not satisfied, Linstar sought out another assassin, someone even more formidable. That was when he contacted Larix, a king of the north, a feared mercenary across the Bigaret continent. If Kalinowski had failed, then a warrior of even greater caliber should be sufficient. However, Larix refused the contract upon discovering the target's identity. "If it were just the elf, fine, but I don't kill children," was his response. The unexpected rejection sent Linstar into despair. His face turned pale, his expression a mix of incredulity and uncontrollable fury. From that moment on, the name of that boy became a specter, a shadow looming over House Joylor. Over the years, the young beast's skills continued to grow at an alarming rate. Stories about him spread like wildfire. Linstar began losing sleep, the deep bags under his eyes reflecting the crushing weight of his paranoia. His nightmares were filled with visions of the boy becoming an unstoppable monster, coming to destroy everything he had built since his parents' deaths. Imagine that, the boy's master had killed his parents, and now the disciple would come to finish off the son. The guard sighed, shaking his head. To him, all of this was unnecessary. What was the point of so much effort against a mere child? A 6-year-old brat killing a saint? That was a joke. If it were true, then now, at 10 years old, he should be out there massacring emperors? The thought made him scoff, but his expression soon turned serious. The Knight Commander found it all madness, but he was loyal to House Joylor. If Linstar believed in this, then it was his duty to ensure that House Joylor was prepared. He turned his gaze to the great fortress behind him, where lights shone through the windows of the main hall. The atmosphere inside was tense. The Joylor family could feel the patriarch's strain. The servants spoke in whispers. The children avoided questioning their father about his constant worry. Even Linstar's wife, Lady Felina, could no longer soothe him as she once had. He had become an obsessed man, and that obsession was slowly poisoning everything around him. The house leader had no other contacts of king-level assassins to hire, so he decided to make preparations for when the boy arrived. He reached out to Kalinowski's disciple, a new North Saint named Uri, and hired him as a temporary guard. Additionally, he forged disadvantageous alliances with other noble houses to secure help in dire times, and even negotiated with Galgard, the commander of the Church's Order of Knights, claiming he was being hunted and forging evidence of threats against his life, securing 2 personal guards at the saint level. Of course, all these negotiations were conducted with extreme secrecy and only with high-ranking individuals, so very few were aware of what was happening. As a result, House Joylor, with its barriers and reinforcements, had become an extremely secure place. However, these maneuvers were gradually staining the house's trust among its allies. He cast a look at the horizon and recalled the past few months. The house leader had grown even more anxious upon learning of the rise of the so-called Iron Legion. He had tried to convince Meles to eliminate this organization before it grew too powerful and, indeed, had garnered some support. After all, the Legion's activities were directly interfering with the interests of many noble houses. Freeing slaves? Teaching them trades? That was dangerous, a threat to the established order. But in the end, his request was unanimously denied. And the reason for this boiled down to a single name: the Red Wolf. Rigger's feat of reducing the Black Troll mercenary group to ashes had spread some fear. No one wanted to provoke him, as, until that moment, he had done nothing directly against Meles. But Linstar Joylore would not accept this. He knew. He was certain that Boy would come after him sooner or later. He couldn't wait for that to happen. So he decided to strike first. However, the Boy was not where they expected. After some conflict with the Iron Legion, they decided to capture several Legion members as hostages to lure him out and perhaps obtain valuable information. As he pondered, the guard turned his gaze to the plains. For an instant, something gleamed in the distance. Lightning? He blinked, trying to understand what he was seeing. And then, in the blink of an eye, a beast-like figure shot toward him, lightning dancing in its claws. His eyes widened. His instincts screamed in alarm. He opened his mouth, desperately drawing breath to shout a warning, but all he could do was gather his final thoughts. Enemy ATT. The impact came before he could finish. POV, Rigger Adoldia Rigger charged at the barrier surrounding House Joylore's mansion with overwhelming speed. Lightning crackled around his claws, pulsating with destructive energy. In the next instant, the barrier cracked like fractured glass before shattering into fragments of blue light. The guard standing before the door barely had time to react, managing only to let out a startled cry. A fierce strike tore through his throat, silencing him before he could finish his warning. The young beastman moved like a predator unleashed upon defenseless prey. His senses were razor-sharp, picking up every sound, every scent. Bodies fell around him, his enemies unable to comprehend what had struck them. It didn't matter who they were, servants, guards. Everything that moved was mercilessly slain. The stench of fear saturated the air, mingling with the scent of warm blood. Yet, amidst it all, something stood out. Rigger lifted his head and sniffed. He could sense it. Kidder, Taze, and the other warriors were beneath the mansion. He was no longer conscious of his own thoughts. His instincts had taken over, whispering only one command: protect your pack. Kill your enemies. His eyes gleamed with silent fury as he looked at his hand, charred from the lightning. His skin was burned, but it slowly regenerated. Before he could reflect on it further, a shiver ran down his spine. Suddenly, something cold touched his neck. A thin blade pressed against his skin, sinking in just enough to draw blood. His instincts roared in alarm, and without thinking, Rigger leapt backward. The metal sliced across his neck, leaving a thin line of red, but it wasn't deep enough to be fatal. He landed on all fours, his stance that of a beast preparing to pounce. Narrowing his eyes, he launched himself forward without hesitation. His claws aimed straight for his attacker's throat, a savage, lethal strike. But once again, danger flashed before him. Something made him hesitate for just a fraction of a second, and instinctively, he pulled his arm back. At that precise moment, a sword gleamed in the air, slicing just millimeters from his forearm. Had he continued his attack, his arm would have been severed. Even so, a shallow wound opened, blood dripping onto the floor. Rigger retreated, still on all fours. His tail swayed from side to side, his fur bristling, his ears twitching at every sound. A deep, threatening growl rumbled in his throat. 3 figures stepped forward. 2 warriors in golden armor approached, the sacred insignias of the Order of Meles gleaming on their chests. Between them stood a slender swordsman, holding a thin blade that still dripped with blood. His cold eyes studied Rigger with curiosity. "Uri, what is this?" one of the paladins asked, frowning. "You said he was a skilled swordsman and mage." But the boy isn't even using a sword, he fights like a wild beast. The swordsman, Yurei, chuckled, twirling his blade between his fingers. I'm surprised too. The reports we have on him seem inaccurate. But hey, that's an advantage for us, isn't it? The other paladin scoffed, clearly unimpressed. 3 saint-ranked warriors ganging up on a child. If word gets out, we'll be a laughingstock. Where's that old man from House Joylore? Yurei smirked and shrugged. Feel free to fight him alone then. The old man said he has to protect Linstar from any other threats that might show up. The warrior remained silent for a moment before assuming the classic defensive stance of the water god style. His gaze locked onto Rigger, analyzing him carefully. To think he'd dare attack a noble house alone. I wouldn't have believed it if I wasn't seeing it myself. This is an insult to Saint Mealy's. Remember, even if we can't kill him, we just have to hold out until Lord Bonnard arrives. He'll make quick work of this heretic. Rigger only growled in response, his eyes smoldering like embers. His muscles were tense, electricity crackling around him. His body instinctively prepared for the next attack. Then, in a flash of lightning, Rigger lunged. He was no longer the same. He wasn't just fighting, he was annihilating everything in his path. His speed was beyond human, nearly impossible to track. His fist tore through the air, striking with such force that the ground trembled beneath him. He charged at the nearest enemy, a paladin. The impact was colossal. The knight, wielding both a sword and a shield, managed to block the punch, but the sheer force sent him skidding 10 meters backward. Rigger didn't stop. He was already in motion again, a blur of destruction, his power manifesting in raw, untamed brutality. Yurei reacted swiftly, sidestepping Rigger's assault. With fluid precision, his sword sliced through the air, aiming for Rigger's throat. But Rigger was faster. He evaded at the last second, forced to retreat only because of the second paladin reinforcing the attack with his broadsword. The 3 enemies were relentless, their strikes coordinated and deadly. They attacked together, forcing Rigger to dodge and counter at a furious pace. Every blow he landed was like a thunderclap, yet he barely used his greatest advantage, his magic. Rigger's body was covered in blood, but he felt nothing. No pain, no satisfaction. He was lost in the frenzy, every attack, every strike, every wound on his enemies an extension of his own primal rage. This was no mere battle, it was the full expression of his beastly nature, unleashed at last. The battlefield lay in ruins, and at its center, Rigger stood, breathing heavily. Blood dripped from his body, yet he felt no exhaustion, only an uncontrollable murderous instinct. Yurei, now confident in their victory, smirked as he stepped forward. He knew they had the advantage. Rigger wasn't even using half of his true strength. When I'm done with you, Yurei sneered, his voice laced with hatred, I'll hunt down that bitch, Verdia Solarion, the one who helped kill my master. The words cut through the air like sharpened blades. Verdia Solarion. The name crashed through Rigger's mind like a surge of electricity. Something inside him trembled, as if the chains of his fury had finally snapped. Verdia, his mentor, the woman he deeply respected. He stopped moving. His mind wavered between reason and instinct. His focus returned, though only faintly, the rage still simmering like a slow-burning fire in his chest. His eyes burned with newfound intensity as he gazed ahead. He knew what he had to do. For the first time in a real battle, he drew both of his swords. Rigger drew both his swords, his movements fluid like a predator preparing for the hunt. He took a low stance, his feet firmly planted on the ground. He was using a dual-wielding technique from the North God style, a technique designed to fight multiple enemies at once. His focus was there on the battle, but his mind, his reason was beginning to waver. The rage, the adrenaline, and the savagery made it difficult to think clearly. Rigger knew that if his thoughts started racing again, he would lose control once more. The objective. Only the objective. He knew what he had to do. Move forward. Rescue his subordinates. And get out. There was no more room for hesitation. His brief moment of rationality was enough for him to realize that fighting in his current state wouldn't be advantageous. The blade in his hand began to glow with the fire magic he was gathering. One of the holy knights glanced at Uri with a judgmental expression. "You've ruined our advantage, Uri," the knight's deep, authoritative voice echoed like thunder. "Finish him off before he fully recovers." Uri, wielding his thin sword, advanced first. His face was displeased, his brow furrowed, knowing it was his own words that had awakened the boy. The other two paladins, in a well-rehearsed maneuver, began moving along the flanks, forming a perfect encirclement. They were ready. The pressure on Rigger increased. But he wasn't ready to stop. With a thunderous sound, Rigger lifted a foot and stomped hard on the ground, as if carrying the weight of the world. The earth beneath him shattered, fragments of stone exploding in every direction. The impact disrupted the momentum of the three knights, forcing them to slow down. In milliseconds, Rigger used the brief moment of advantage to strike. With Tsukikage and Night Hunter in hand, he entered a dance of blades, holding off the three attackers simultaneously. The paladin's swords clashed against his, but Rigger remained focused. He dodged with the agility of a feline, his reflexes heightened by the wild instincts in his body. But the battle wouldn't be easy. Then Uri, with a mocking grin, laughed and charged again. His eyes gleamed with cruel confidence. He seemed convinced that the fight was under control. He believed Rigger still wasn't using magic, a fatal flaw in his reasoning. "Looks like he's still not using magic. Ha ha ha." Uri taunted, and Rigger sensed his movement. He knew what was coming. At that very moment, Rigger turned with terrifying speed. His eyes shone with magical power that he made no effort to hide. He knew he had to be fast and decisive. With a precise motion, Tsukikage sliced through the air in a long arc, and a wave of fire erupted outward. The attack was immense, a flame slice that left the air hot and charged with power. Uri, caught off guard, retreated quickly, trying to evade the wave of flames, but it wasn't enough. The scorching fire engulfed him, searing his clothes and nearly burning his skin. He barely had time to process what was happening. But what he didn't expect, what no one expected, was what happened next. From within the flames, a black sword emerged, spinning at an astonishing speed. Night Hunter. The blade, crackling with lightning, cut through the air at an insane velocity. Uri tried to block, but the moment his sword met Rigger's blade, the impact was devastating. Uri's weapon shattered into pieces, unable to withstand Night Hunter's power. Before he could even react, the blade pierced his forehead with deadly precision, driving through his eye and killing him instantly. Everything happened so fast that the other two knights were left stunned. The shock was palpable. Rigger had killed Uri, which was not expected. They had no information about Rigger's second magic sword, a blade capable of piercing common swords and covered in lightning, increasing its speed. A single moment of surprise had been enough to cost Uri his life. With a quick and fluid motion, Rigger extended his hand while running. Night Hunter responded to his command, vibrating as it pierced through Uri's skull and returned toward him. The blade flew into his hand, and Rigger caught it with dexterity, breaking through the enemy's encirclement. There was no time to waste. Rigger did not pause to boast or to look at what was left of his enemies. The two holy knights, now dazed, were still in shock, unable to understand what had just happened. But Rigger was not there to waste time with them. He needed to find his subordinates. Kidder, Taze, and the others were there. He quickly followed their scent, his focus now entirely on his goal. He dashed through the corridors of the house with the agility of a predator, his feet practically gliding over the floor. The sounds of battle faded behind him, and he did not look back. Rigger raced through the mansion's corridors with the agility of a fleeing predator. Each step was calculated, each movement a desperate attempt to reach the stairs that, according to his sharpened instincts, led to the lower part of the house. His ragged breathing mixed with the echo of footsteps, while the latent pain from his wounds blended with the adrenaline driving him forward. Upon spotting the stairs ahead, a guard blocked his path. Without hesitation, Rigger charged. In a lightning-fast movement, Tsukikage's blade slashed toward the man's neck. The strike neared victory. The blade gleamed, ready to meet flesh. However, in a split second, a visceral instinct flared in his mind. Death. The warning rang with an intensity he had never experienced before, freezing his thoughts for a brief second. He knew that in the next moment, if he did not act, he would be doomed. With the speed of a primal reflex, Rigger focused all his energy and wove, in an almost automatic gesture, the strongest barrier he could muster around his neck at that instant. Without wasting a second, he activated a burst step, and his body exploded into motion. But then Rigger saw it, a silver sword emerging from the chaos. The gleaming blade had a golden hilt, finely crafted in the shape of a stag, with two branches mimicking antlers. It advanced slowly but with lethal precision, slicing through the flames of his burst step as it approached. Time seemed to slow as the sword neared. No matter how fast Rigger moved with his superhuman speed, that attack seemed inevitable. He managed to avoid decapitation, but the impact was devastating. The silver blade, driven by overwhelming energy, swept across his left arm with a clean and precise cut, severing it up to the elbow. The searing pain and the sensation of emptiness mixed in his mind, but Rigger did not allow despair to consume him. Determination screamed within him. Amid the chaos, his eyes locked onto the guard blocking the staircase entrance. Unlike the others, this man wore silver armor, not gold, signs of wear and a face that had seen more than 50 years of life, with graying hair and a well-groomed beard. At first glance, he might have gone unnoticed, appearing as just another guard. But something about his presence, an aura of calm and at the same time subtle danger, set Rigger's feral instincts on edge. He looked at his severed arm on the ground, several meters away from the guard. He could still heal it if not too much time passed. He thought about grabbing it. But before he could move, the old guard raised his hand. With a controlled motion, he pulled out a paper inscribed with a magic circle that activated instantly. A sphere of fire formed and with surgical precision, was launched directly at Rigger's severed arm. Rigger shifted his gaze to the old man, whose eyes now gleamed with an unsettling serenity. The guard advanced with firm, measured steps, and his voice, surprisingly calm, cut through the battle's tumult. "You are a great warrior, boy. Few, only 4 opponents in my lifetime, have survived after attacking me without knowing who I was before you. I am Lord Danos Bonart, head of the noble house Bonart of Meles, the protector of Meles, and ranked as a water god-style king." The revelation caught him off guard. The old man's voice was serene, yet carried the weight of authority and a history of battles. Noticing Rigger's hesitation, that wavering between reason and instinct, Lord Bonart let out a slight sigh, as if lamenting the tragic fate of such a formidable warrior. "Are you still rational? What a pity. A formidable warrior who opposes St. Meles, and now more beast than man, taken over by demonic energies. This is the inevitable fate." As he spoke, he prepared his sword with calm precision, as if every movement was part of a long-practiced choreography. Rigger's mind spun with countless thoughts. The pain from his lost arm throbbed, mingling with adrenaline and rage. His instincts, now sharpened by the sight of Lord Bonart, a figure who at first seemed like just another guard but whose threatening aura became clearer with each passing second, screamed for action. As his mind wavered between reason and instinct, Rigger felt the need to push past this obstacle. An inner voice urged him into battle, to keep fighting, even with one arm missing, to eliminate any threat standing between him and those who depended on him. With a restrained growl and eyes that held a mixture of madness and determination, Rigger lunged toward Lord Bonart. But before he could gain speed, an imposing figure blocked his path. His steps faltered for a brief instant as his eyes focused on the woman standing before him. She was a very familiar beast woman, silver hair and dark skin. Ghislaine Didoldia, gathering all her social skills to convince him, spoke in a toneless voice, "Rigger, regain your senses." The phrase echoed through the corridors, causing the mist clouding his mind to begin to lift, even if just for a brief, painful moment. He regained his senses, or at least enough to recognize what stood before him. However, as clarity returned, his primal instinct screamed at him. This woman was blocking him, preventing his advance. Ghislaine remained motionless, her lips slightly parted in an almost inaudible murmur, so it didn't work on. Her eyes revealed no emotion, but her posture was firm and resolute. Observing the scene, the protector of Meles watched in perplexity, murmuring to himself, "What didn't work? Was that her best attempt?" Doubt hung in the air, but Ghislaine seemed convinced that she had done her best to persuade him with words. When Rigger, his eyes bloodshot and his spirit still unbalanced, took his stance to attack, she also positioned herself, paying attention to the movements of the old guard in the background. With a violent impulse, Rigger lunged forward. But as his muscles stretched to deliver the sword strike, he saw a red blade approaching rapidly, surpassing him vastly in speed and power. Yet strangely, the sensation of death did not come. He tried to react, but time, merciless as ever, did not allow it. The blades clashed with fatal precision. A long diagonal cut opened across Rigger's chest, pain exploding in his mind like 1,000 knives. He felt the steel of Hiramyun slicing through his flesh. For a moment, as he fell to the ground, the world shrank into a succession of flashes, the burning of his wound, the muffled sound of his ragged breathing, the scent of blood and magic mixed in the air. His mind, once a chaotic battlefield, suddenly cleared. Every thought, once shrouded in disorder, returned to order in an almost miraculous way. He lay on the ground, bleeding from both his severed arm, cut off at the elbow, and the massive wound on his chest. Yet, surprisingly, a faint smile formed on his lips. "I'm alive," he murmured to himself, his voice broken by pain. His now clear and serene gaze met Ghislaine's as she approached. She looked down at him, and upon seeing that he no longer seemed out of control, she gave a barely perceptible smile. "You once said during our training, Rigger, that as long as you had mana, you could heal from any injury quickly, except for lost limbs or shredded organs." Ghislaine glanced at his wound, then at the old man, who still blocked the door to the stairs. "I don't know what happened in Tinaver, but I know you'll handle everything much more easily if you're lucid." At that moment, the two holy knights who had been fighting Rigger, whom he had left behind, finally reached the hall. The old guard, now with his silver armor gleaming under the flickering lights, kept his gaze fixed, observing every movement with an almost unsettling calm. Ghislaine turned to them, her voice unwavering in determination. "Heal yourself quickly, Rigger. I'll hold them off." As she spoke, Rigger struggled to rise while channeling advanced healing magic throughout his body. Pain pulsed with every beat of his heart, but the mental clarity that had returned now shone in his eyes. His once murky and imprecise thoughts were now sharp and focused. He realized he might have made a mistake in attacking the Joylor estate so rashly and had likely killed many innocent people, but these were things he couldn't afford to dwell on now. He was here, and now that it had begun, he would kill them all, including this old man, to ensure there were no witnesses left. He sharpened his senses, trying to detect any reinforcements that might be arriving, but he felt nothing. Then he thought, that old Danos must be the reinforcement, and he really is a massive obstacle. Even in his weakened state, he knew he couldn't allow himself to sink into pain. Every wound, every loss, was a cruel reminder of the price of the path he had chosen. But in that moment, Ghislaine's intervention offered him a new chance, a chance to regain control and keep fighting, even with only one arm. As Ghislaine fended off the attacks of the two knights, the old guard was finally forced to intervene. This put Ghislaine at a disadvantage, as the sword god style was restricted by the water god style. Yet, even so, she fought fiercely, precise and calm. Rigger, blood still dripping from his wounds but his mind now clear, gathered his strength and rose to his feet. Objectively speaking, Rigger was as strong as a king-level combatant, but it wasn't that simple. There are many variables in a person's combat strength. For example, if Rigger concentrated a large amount of mana into a single hellish slash, as he had done at the Black Troll's base, and ambushed Ghislaine, she would almost certainly be killed, and if she survived, it would be by sheer luck and with grave injuries. If he kept his distance, he could even use the king-level spell Earth Rupture to massacre an entire army, as he was almost certain he could wield its superior version, the Emperor-level Earthquake. However, in the midst of close-quarters combat, these spells couldn't be used casually. His ability to manipulate mana was already extremely fast, allowing him to cast spells even in high-speed battles, but they had their limits. Against Ghislaine, he couldn't strengthen his spells as much as usual, because a single delay would result in his defeat. Other variables included nearby allies who restricted his magic, the information the enemy had on him, natural counterattacks, such as the flow of the water god style, which could cut through magic, among others. This was also why he was truly enjoying lightning magic, It was fast, lethal, contained, and nearly indefensible. The same went for barrier magic, which had incredible versatility and potential. The night at Joylor's mansion was torn apart by a deafening shockwave. Sparks cut through the air as Ghislaine fought Donnerbonart and the two knights. All three opponents had mastered flow, severely restricting Ghislaine's longsword of light. They seemed unwavering, and the beast woman was at a great disadvantage. Her swift and lethal attacks were always defended against and countered. And whenever she had a chance to kill one of them, Bonart would always interfere. Ghislaine vanished into a blur, her sword whistling through the air. Her strike was met by the blade of one of the Saint-Tier knights, who slightly tilted his weapon, redirecting the force of the attack into the ground. The floor cracked under the impact, but the man remained firm. Donner and the other knight moved simultaneously, flowing like waves toward Ghislaine. But Rigger, who had regained consciousness, had finally healed his wounds enough to fight. He wielded only Tsukikage, as only emptiness remained where his left arm had once been. Rigger dashed forward, his blue blade gleaming as it reflected the flames he had conjured. With a snap, he unleashed an arc of fire, attempting to force Donner to halt his attack. But the Water God King merely rotated his sword toward it, slicing vertically through the incoming wave of fire. Rigger watched intently with his magic eye. That use of Tuki was truly mysterious and fascinating. TCH. Rigger growled, leaping to the side the moment a swift thrust from the other knight attempted to pierce his flank. He conjured a stone barrier between them, causing the blade to ricochet. Donner advanced, stopping beside Rigger with an upward slash. The silver blade gleamed, reflecting the lightning Rigger instinctively conjured in counterattack. Electricity exploded across the battlefield, and Donner was momentarily stunned as he witnessed this unknown magic. The speed of the attack and the element of surprise prevented him from making an adequate defensive move, sending him flying like a ragdoll. The mansion's walls and pillars collapsed from the impact of the lightning. Rigger didn't stop the lightning and redirected it toward the knight closest to Ghislaine. The man felt his arm hairs stand on end but remained calm. When he thought of using flow to absorb the attack, it had already struck, sending him flying dozens of meters just like the first. The knight flanking Rigger didn't allow him to continue, attacking from behind, forcing him to block with Tsukikage, interrupting his spell. Ghislaine smiled. Her body moved a mere instant after understanding what had happened. She targeted the knight attacking Rigger. Before he could react, Ghislaine was upon him, executing a perfect longsword of light. He focused all his attention on defending the lethal strike, barely managing to redirect the blow with his sword and suffering a wound to his shoulder. Rigger didn't waste the opportunity. Fighting with only one arm felt strange, but he still had his legs. He spun, confusing the knight, and landed a kick to his ribs. The force sent the knight hurtling backward, leaving a deep trench in the stone floor and crashing through wall after wall. At that moment, Donner Bonart emerged from the rubble, holding a glowing magic circle in his hand, likely what he had used to dispel the electricity from his body. Analyzing the battle, he spoke with a look of disgust. Demonic magic. Only Laplace could control magic at such a level. It seems you've delved even deeper into the demonic path than I had imagined. When Rigger saw him, he frowned. Those healing magic circles are a problem. We have to kill them immediately when we wound them. Ghislaine silently agreed and charged again, while Rigger rushed toward the other knight who had been struck by lightning before he could recover. Donner remained impassive, like a mountain. His body moved like water flowing over a rock, dodging each of Ghislaine's attacks with supernatural fluidity. Shockwaves from their clashes rippled through the debris-filled battlefield. Then, he struck. Rigger reached the knight, who was getting up and assuming the water god-style stance, but still seemed dazed. In that brief pause, Rigger channeled as much mana as he could into Tsukikage. Since his sword now required 9 times less mana for the same level of attack, even those few instants were enough for high-temperature purple flames to course along his blade. Rigger attacked with a magic-infused stance, his magic eye scanning beyond the warrior to ensure no one else was caught in the crossfire. The warrior saw Rigger's intent, and terror flashed across his face. He retreated as fast as he could, but his muscles were still stiff from the lightning. It was enough. Rigger spoke in his mind, hellish / reduced. The saint-level warrior desperately raised his sword to defend, but it was futile. A massive, flaming slash erupted forth. Rigger's low stance allowed him to launch the strike upward, his ascending slash tearing through the space ahead like a whirlwind of pure destruction. The purple flame expanded violently, rising like a demonic wave of fire toward the sky, consuming everything in its path. The upper half of the warrior was turned to ashes, while the lower half fell to the ground with a dull thud. Rigger heard the other knight, the one he had kicked away, screaming as he charged toward him. "No, you freak, I'll kill you." Meanwhile, Ghislaine struck at Donner from all sides, but the warrior remained untouchable. He raised his blade, and for an instant, the world seemed to freeze. As Ghislaine attacked once more, he used the water god-style secret technique. "Tidal flow," Donner recited, his voice as sharp as a blade. Ghislaine was moments away from completing her strike when she heard it. Her instinct screamed at her, and she abandoned the attack, leaping back. But contrary to her expectations, she couldn't escape the range of his sword. No matter her speed, it felt as if she were being pulled in, as if the attack was inescapable. But Ghislaine was no ordinary warrior. She observed and analyzed the situation in an instant, making the best possible decision. She struck Donner's sword with Hiramyun. Their blades clashed, like a speeding car crashing into a stationary truck. Neither side gained the upper hand, and a shockwave erupted, cracking the ground around them. Ghislaine, her sharp gaze locked onto Donner, sensed the danger of this technique, realizing that this must have been what took Rigger's arm. Rigger was locked in combat with the remaining knight, but used Flash Step to instantly distance himself. He began chanting earth magic. His hands glowed with heavy energy as he summoned massive stone pillars that erupted from the ground, forming impenetrable barriers that disrupted Donner's movements. But that alone wasn't enough to destabilize tidal flow. Donner reacted swiftly, cutting down any attacks aimed at him. He was confident in blocking almost any magic with his sword, except for lightning magic, which forced him to retreat. But killing him wasn't Rigger's goal, only restraining him. "Now!" Rigger shouted. Ghislaine wasted no time. With her blinding speed, she surged forward like a storm, delivering a lethal strike to the last remaining knight. The man attempted to dodge using flow, but he was already exhausted and had bruised ribs. Ghislaine struck him with a swift, deep, and precise cut. He staggered, staring at the diagonal wound that had sliced through his organs and bones before collapsing heavily to the ground. The tide of battle had shifted. Donner was now alone. "It can't end like this," Donner muttered, his face dark. He tried to regain control, but Rigger and Ghislaine's confidence was overwhelming. The battle was about to take a decisive turn. With a resolute movement, Ghislaine attacked again. The Joylore mansion was rapidly crumbling from the intensity of the battle. Few structures remained standing after the relentless fighting. Donner looked around, frustration twisting his face. He knew he was only alive because he practiced the water god style, focusing on defense. But at the same time, there was no turning back. He could only stall for as long as possible. Those flashy magic attacks had undoubtedly drawn the attention of Militian. The battlefield was engulfed in chaos. The Joylore mansion, now mostly in ruins, trembled under the force of explosions and clashing blades. The intensity of the fight had devastated the area. It was only a matter of time before they killed him. One mistake, and he would be struck by lightning. But at that moment, Rigger heard in the distance, near Militian's gates, about 10 people rapidly approaching the mansion. They were winning without a doubt, but time was against them. Militian certainly wouldn't send weaklings knowing Donner was already here. Rigger was decisive. He wouldn't hesitate and allow reinforcements to arrive and settle the fight. Donner Bonart, now visibly exhausted and wounded, was struggling to maintain his composure. Rigger spoke. "Ghislaine, Militian has sent reinforcements. I'm going to free my subordinates, and we're leaving immediately. Can you hold him off?" She looked at him. The intensity of the battle was immense, yet Ghislaine remained calm, her gaze unwavering, without hesitation. "I can." Without hesitation, Ghislaine launched herself at Donner with lethal speed, her blade slicing through the air with precision. Donner, now more aggressive, unleashed a furious attack, using tidal flow in an attempt to regain control of the fight. Seeing the opportunity, Rigger did not hesitate. He shot forward toward the staircase leading to the prisoners, his only hand gathering lightning magic into Tsukikage. Meanwhile, Ghislaine continued pressing Donner. The force of her attacks made it impossible for the already wounded and exhausted knight to stop Rigger. Rigger quickly found the staircase and ran without stopping. The air underground was dense, saturated with the acrid scent of dried blood and rotting flesh. Heavy footsteps echoed through the damp corridors as Rigger descended the stone stairs, his mind still reverberating with the adrenaline of battle. His heart pounded rapidly, but nothing could have prepared him for what he would find below. As he crossed the final passage, he froze. The scene before him was a living nightmare. Bodies. Mutilated bodies hung from iron hooks embedded in the ceiling, their mangled forms swaying slightly in the cold, fetid air. Arms and legs had been torn off at the base, leaving only bloody torsos and faces twisted in agony. Puddles of blood soaked the stone floor, forming a crimson swamp around the corpses. Some mouths were still open in silent screams, frozen in the torment of their last breaths. The flickering torchlight trembled over the macabre scene, casting grotesque shadows on the damp walls. At the center of the chamber, a young guard wearing the blue armor of the Templar Order held his sword with trembling hands, protecting Linstar Joylor, the man who had sent assassins to kill Verdia, the one who had captured his subordinates. Beside Linstar, a mage, or perhaps a priest, stood with a neutral posture, observing everything with no apparent emotion. But Rigger couldn't take his eyes off the mutilated bodies. Apparently, they were behind a magic barrier as their last line of defense. His chest tightened as he recognized the prisoners hanging near the barrier. 6 had been taken, and now 5 were hanging. Among them, Kidder, the man who had been with Rigger since the early days of his fight against the slave traffickers in the Great Forest. Kidder was dead. There was no movement, no sign of breathing. His glazed eyes stared into nothingness, his mouth slightly open as if he still wanted to say something. Rigger felt something inside him shatter. Of the other 4, 2 were barely alive. Their weak breaths and skeletal bodies were covered in marks of torture. One of them was Taze. Only one still had all their limbs intact, unconscious and hanging like the others. Guilt struck Rigger like a serrated blade. He should have arrived sooner. He should have been faster. His mind swirled in a whirlwind of emotions. Shock, rage, sorrow, guilt. A primal scream threatened to escape his throat, his consciousness teetering on the edge, his eyes burning with restrained fury. But then, a voice cut through the silence, snapping him out of his thoughts. "You see. I told you to go help in the fight. Now what will you do?" Linstar shouted in desperation, casting a panicked glance at the guard beside him. The young knight hesitated, adjusting his stance. "We're surrounded by a king-level physical and magical barrier. And I'm here to protect you as a last resort, sir." He never finished the sentence. A thunderous crack tore through the air. In one instant, the guard was alive. In the next, his body was split in half. Rigger's blade, cloaked in violet lightning, cut through him as if slicing through air. Only after Rigger had already crossed the space between them did the shockwave hit, sending blood and viscera exploding across the floor. Rage boiled inside him like magma, his body pulsing with an almost tangible killing intent. Linstar collapsed to his knees, his eyes wide with pure terror. His body trembled uncontrollably, and a foul stench filled the air as he wet himself. "Don't kill me," he begged, tears and snot streaming down his face. "Your master killed my parents first." Rigger didn't blink. The hatred in his gaze was deep, abyssal, something that consumed any trace of mercy within him. "What a shame I don't have time to give you the most painful death possible." His voice was as cold as ice. "Despite everything, you still have some luck left." Linstar opened his mouth to scream, trying to utter another desperate plea, but all that was heard was the sharp crack of a stone fired at absurd speed. The projectile pierced his skull like a rifle shot, scattering bone fragments and brain matter across the bloodied floor. Linstar Joylor died without even understanding what had happened. Rigger slowly turned to the priest, his eyes still burning with fury. The man showed no fear, only acceptance. "If you can heal their limbs, you're free," Rigger said, his voice empty. As if he had been expecting it, the priest nodded. You can heal them faster. Their wounds aren't fatal, just blood loss. But to restore their limbs, saint-level magic is required. He pointed to a sack nearby. The bones and limbs of the 2 survivors are in there. Rigger wasted no time. He rushed to tase and the other survivor, activating his healing magic. The wounds closed, the bleeding stopped, and their breathing steadied. It wasn't enough, but it was a start. Tase opened his eyes for a moment, his gaze empty, but a miserable smile curled his bloodied lips when he saw Rigger. I didn't tell them anything, boss. His voice was a whisper before he slipped back into unconsciousness. The smell of blood lingered in the air, thick and nauseating, mixing with the stifling heat of the hall filled with bodies. The floor was drenched in crimson, and the night's scattered entrails gave the scene a grotesque appearance. Rigger took a deep breath, suppressing the fury burning within him. There was no time for mourning now. His gaze shifted to one of the hanging bodies. Still intact and breathing. Palak. The beastman of the Adoldia race was hanging from a hook, bound by chains, his breathing ragged and uneven. Rigger quickly approached and woke him with a slight shock. His eyes shot open, wide with terror. He choked on a sob and tried to move, but his body was still weak. When he finally focused on the figure before him, his fearful gaze turned into pure relief. Tears welled up in his eyes as he mumbled, his voice trembling, "Finally, boss. The others, they..." Rigger cut him off abruptly. The rumbling from the upper floor echoed through the mansion, reminding him of the urgency of the situation. Mealy's reinforcements were on their way, and he couldn't afford to waste any more time here. There's no time for explanations. Tase and Feel are still alive. Take them back to Tinaver. His voice was firm and unwavering. And take this bag. It has their missing limbs. The journey will only take a few hours, but I'll meet you on the way. With precise movement, Rigger raised his blade and cut the chains binding Palak, healing his wound swiftly. The beastman collapsed onto his knees for a moment, still trying to process everything, but soon his expression changed. The fear clouding his eyes was now replaced by determination. I won't fail you again, boss. He nodded and with effort, carefully lifted Tase and Feel onto his shoulders. Wasting no time, Rigger raised his hand and focused his mana. The air vibrated around him, and with a single sharp glance from his magic eye, he fired a concentrated blast of fire at the ceiling. The stone structure gave way, opening a hole wide enough for Palak to pass through. Then, he quickly molded an improvised staircase with earth magic, creating a safe path for escape. Palak didn't hesitate. With his comrades on his shoulders, he climbed through the passage without looking back. Rigger watched his figure disappear through the opening before turning his attention to the priest, who still stood motionless amidst the massacre. Are you a saint-level healing mage? Rigger asked, his voice returning to its usual cold tone. The priest, a man in white robes with weary features, nodded slowly. Rigger narrowed his eyes. Where does House Joylore keep its spells? The man didn't hesitate. He simply pointed to a side door in the hall and answered directly, there's a barrier protecting them. The password is a combination of codes. While speaking, he was already walking toward the door, touching its surface and murmuring low incantations. A slight magical ripple swept through the invisible barrier protecting the entrance, and a metallic sound echoed as the lock disengaged. Rigger frowned. He had intended to extract information from the priest by force and then kill him, but now the situation was becoming confusing. Why was he helping so readily? He narrowed his eyes, suspicious. Who are you, and why are you helping me? The priest seemed surprised by the question. After a moment, he murmured, Didn't you make a deal with the Pope? Then why haven't you killed me? Rigger narrowed his eyes. The Pope? I made no deal. I simply invaded the Joylore house after learning that my subordinates were here. Now it was the priest's turn to look truly shocked. His face paled as he muttered, You're insane. He took a deep breath and now showing slight fear, continued, I was sent here by the Pope to ensure your loved ones wouldn't die. Unfortunately, Kidder provoked Lord Linstar too much, who killed him personally, but Taze, Dodoldio and Feel are only alive because I kept them that way. Someone from your legion contacted the Pope's faction after the kidnapping, since you weren't around to help. That's why I thought you hadn't killed me, because that was the deal." Sweat began to drip down the priest's forehead as his eyes darted to the shattered remains of the Joylore Knight on the ground. It was obvious he had realized how close he had been to death. Rigger remained silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the priest, evaluating his breathing and heartbeat. Nothing indicated a lie. That only deepened his disappointment in himself. His rage had completely blinded him. And now, the mistakes he had made that night could not be erased. At last, he sighed. "I'll believe you, for now." The priest nodded quickly, relieved. Without further delay, Rigger entered the spell chamber of the Joylore house. The shelves were filled with ancient grimoires and well-preserved scrolls. His eyes scanned the rows of books, quickly grabbing any spell or enchantment he had yet to master. His master possessed vast knowledge, and few books here were new to him. However, what he managed to gather amounted to a heavy backpack. And then, his eyes widened as he found something unexpected. A healing spell and some detoxification spells at saint level. In just 30 seconds, he gathered everything he could carry and left the chamber, still feeling his heart pounding as memories of his actions that night surfaced. He couldn't afford to stop and think. Rigger took a deep breath, focusing on his surroundings. His beastly senses picked up the faintest sounds from the surface. With his sharpened hearing, he discerned the heavy coordinated footsteps of Mealy's reinforcements approaching the main entrance of the Joylore house. His magic-enhanced eyes gleamed as they pierced through walls and obstacles, revealing the presence of multiple warriors emerging from the shadows of the night. Time was against him. Outside, the battle was still ongoing. Ghislaine, the Black Wolf, faced Donner Bonart, master of the Water God style. The fight was evenly matched. As fast and precise as she was, the fluid and relentless form of Donner's defense nullified her attacks. Her blade was deflected, her offense repelled. However, Ghislaine's beastly instincts allowed her to avoid the lethal strikes of the secret technique, Tide Flow, keeping her alive. Then, realizing the disadvantage of continuing the duel, Ghislaine leaped back, putting distance between herself and her opponent. The next instant, the ground where she had stood was shattered by a brutal impact. A massive hammer descended like thunder, cracking the earth with its destructive force. The blow came from one of the new opponents who had just arrived. 10 knights emerged around the battlefield, their armor gleaming under the moonlight. The silver, blue, and white colors marked their affiliations: Knights of the Church Order, the Temple Order, and the Order of Instruction. Each of them was at least a saint-level warrior. 4 of them, however, emanated an even more menacing presence, surpassing that classification. At the center of the group, imposing and unshakable, stood Galgard Nashvenik, the man known as the strongest man in Mealy's, commander of the Order of Instruction. His silver armor shone brilliantly, his broadsword resting at his waist like a slumbering beast. The aura he exuded was heavy, dense, almost suffocating. Ghislaine glanced at him and frowned. He was dangerous, almost as dangerous as her master, Gol Farayan. The priests moved quickly, healing Donner Bonart while Galgard analyzed the scene. His cold, meticulous gaze studied Ghislaine, capturing every detail of her stance. Then his voice cut through the silence like a sharp blade. "What does the renowned Black Wolf have against Mealy's to justify this attack?" His voice was deep, expressionless, laden with absolute authority. He rarely smiled, and even standing still, his presence was overwhelming. Ghislaine remained firm, her expression serious and vigilant. "I came to help a friend." Her response was simple, but her determination was clear. Before Galgard could respond, the ground beneath them exploded. From underground, a figure emerged, engulfed in blazing flames. The searing heat spread instantly, distorting the air around him and making the knights instinctively step back. The presence was overwhelming. Rigger Adoldia burst from the rubble, wielding Tsukikij with his lone arm. Fierce flames enveloped the blue blade, dancing like hungry serpents. His expression was calm, but his eyes burned with incandescent determination. "Ghislaine, fall back. Leave this to me." His voice was firm, unquestionable. Ghislaine hesitated for a second, analyzing his expression. Then, seeing the unwavering confidence in him, she nodded and stepped back. Rigger turned his gaze to Galgard and the other knights. He raised his voice, clear and imposing. "I am Rigger Adoldia, of the Doldia tribe and leader of the Iron Legion." Silence lingered for a moment. Then one of the knights from the Temple Order muttered, his tone dripping with contempt, "Don't forget to add genocidal to your introduction." Before he could continue, Galgard shot him a sharp look. The knight immediately fell silent, feeling the weight of his leader's presence. Rigger did not waver. His flames flared, crackling with increasing intensity. His gaze locked onto the strongest man of the Order of Instruction. The tension was palpable. Rigger Adoldia. The name was spoken firmly by Galgard Nash-Venik. The man kept his eyes fixed on the figure before him. Rigger's sword, Tsukikij, burned with violent blue flames, and the ground around them had turned into a sea of molten rock. The scorching heat distorted the air, and the nearby walls were already turning to ash. Even so, Galgard did not move. "I hope you have a good explanation for your indiscriminate massacre of the Knights of the Temple Order and House Joylor." His voice was as sharp as his blade, each word carefully chosen. Rigger raised an eyebrow at the choice of words. He didn't say Knights of Melees, but instead deliberately separated the groups, leaving room for justification. Even so, the knights surrounding Galgard frowned, some clenching their fists, others their jaws. Their anger was palpable, but still contained by the presence of their commander. Rigger took a deep breath, expanding his barrier against the heat so that his own flames wouldn't consume him. "I came to rescue my subordinates, who were being cruelly tortured and killed when I arrived." His voice carried pure hatred. Galgard continued staring at him, seemingly unfazed by the fire accumulating on the blade. "And do you have proof of these events?" Rigger scoffed, mocking. "Just look in the mansion's underground. You will see the rot of a noble Melee's house." He spat on the ground, but the saliva evaporated before it even touched it. The knights shifted, even more irritated. However, none of them moved. Everyone there knew what that sword in Rigger's hand had done in the Zantport forest. They hesitated not out of a lack of courage, but out of pure survival instinct. Galgard furrowed his brow, his expression growing even more severe. "That justifies the guards and even the Joylor family. But what about the servants? Even the children who lived in this mansion? Is this how the Iron Legion does things?" Those words hit Rigger like an invisible strike. For a moment, his mind went blank. He had been avoiding and pushing these thoughts to the back of his mind. Amidst the heat of battle, his fury and thirst for revenge, he had struck indiscriminately. But he couldn't afford to show weakness now. "DaoistJunkYard is 13 years old," he retorted aggressively, trying to stifle the growing guilt. "Do you think he's not a child? I found him mutilated, missing all 4 limbs, covered in lacerations. Is this how Melees does things?" His voice trembled with genuine rage, but his own justification sounded hollow even to himself. The images of the battle resurfaced in his mind. He remembered the cuts he had inflicted, the fire-consuming bodies that perhaps weren't warriors, the absolute destruction he had caused. And now, faced with Galgard's accusation, he tried to appear unaffected. Galgard remained silent, but his expression hardened, a slight disgust clearly discernible on his face. "Indeed, the Joylor family deserved the fate that befell them, if your claims are true. But from what I've heard, DaoistJunkYard was a warrior. The children in this mansion were not." His gaze swept across the scene. "The Church of Melees offered a partnership, yet you spat on our goodwill by massacring civilians and innocents due to your own petty rage. I must say, from the stories I've heard of the Red Wolf, I expected more." Every word Galgard spoke was like a dagger piercing him. The insults hurt even more when they were true. And the truth was that at the first real hardship he encountered, Rigger lost control and threw away any cooperation Melees might have been willing to offer. "But I don't want to risk you still being in a frenzy and deciding to unleash your magic upon Melees and my men without regard for innocent lives." His gaze held a measure of caution, but also a barely concealed contempt. The temperature around them rose uncontrollably. The hellish slash was fully formed. The Saint-level knights had retreated due to the heat, while the King-level ones barely remained standing. Rigger's skin burned and regenerated simultaneously due to the proximity of his own devastating energy. But Galgard did not yield. He raised a hand and touched the sheathed sword at his waist. In the next instant, an oppressive aura spread through the air. Its weight bore down on Rigger like a mountain, and he knew without a doubt that Galgard was an opponent he could not defeat in a direct duel. Not even by unleashing the hellish slash at this distance. Stand down immediately. Galgard's voice was an absolute command. And a warning, if you ever point that flaming sword at the city of Meles again, I will hunt you to the ends of the world, no matter the price I must pay. Rigger felt his heart grow heavy. He wanted to fight. He wanted to scream. He wanted to argue and say that he was right. But the words got caught in his throat. No experience in either of his lives had prepared him for this situation. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his breathing, then murmured, "Ghislaine, let's fall back." The flames around Tsukikage still roared as he turned, walking slowly toward the forest. Little by little, the intensity of the flames waned, but the weight in his chest did not lessen. With every step he took, he felt as if something inside him was changing, as if he were nothing more than a bandit fleeing the scene of a crime. When he looked back, he saw the Joylore mansion disappearing into the distance. And for the first time in a long while, Rigger wondered if, that night, he had become exactly kind of person who wanted to destroy. The forest seemed to swallow everything around Rigger. He and Ghislaine ran side by side. He with slumped shoulders, his body covered in dirt and blood, and his left arm missing, did not exchange a single word. Every step he took without something pressing him to act was more time for him to think. He could not clearly remember the attack on the Joylore estate. But in some ways, that made it worse. He only recalled flashes. Anything that moved was mercilessly slaughtered in his fury, and images of him tearing out the throats of guards and servants flashed in sequence through his mind as his thoughts began to settle. Every movement felt heavier than the last. Every second he ran without something to distract him. The weight of guilt seemed to glue his feet to the ground. He could no longer shake off the image of the dead, their screams, the sound of his claws cutting through flesh, the same way his doubts were cutting through himself. The silence stretched between them. Ghislaine, running with the energy that kept her moving forward, noticed something was wrong. The boy, once so focused and direct, now seemed distant, lost in thoughts she could not guess. Each passing second was another step toward the abyss he was sinking into. But she was not good with words, nor with comfort. So she simply remained silent, glancing at him sideways while keeping her pace steady. Ghislaine's eyes drifted toward him for a moment. When she first met Rigger, she thought of him as a prodigy, a boy with more talent than anyone she had ever seen. But as time passed and she learned more about him, what fascinated her the most was his intelligence and the maturity he displayed, always so focused and capable. When he faced the Holy Order of Meles, she admired his courage and fighting spirit. Over time, without realizing it, she had begun to see him as an equal. But now, something about his posture had changed. Then, finally, they spotted the rest of the group. Polak, Taze, and Feel were ahead, running quickly. Polak, carrying Taze and Feel on his shoulders, seemed slower than usual. When he noticed the two approaching, he slowed down, abruptly stopping and turning to face them. Without hesitation, Rigger shouted, "Polak, it's us." The beastman stopped, and upon seeing Rigger's condition, his eyes widened. He stared for a moment, but what shocked him the most was the absence of his leader's arm. Horror spread across his face. "Boss, your arm!" he exclaimed, panic evident in his voice. Rigger took a deep breath, as if trying to shake off the weight on his shoulders. "Don't worry about that. Give me the two of them. We need to get back as quickly as possible." Polak glanced at Ghislaine, but she remained expressionless, her gaze focused elsewhere. He wanted to ask more, but seeing Rigger's grim expression, he knew he shouldn't. The decision was made in silence, and the three of them departed without another word, heading for the Iron Legion's base. Tinaver was close to Melitian. Just a few hours of running would be enough to reach it. Rigger and Ghislaine arrived even faster, fueled by Rigger's fury. What awaited them at the base initially seemed like relief, but quickly became another reminder of the battle, a reconstruction after destruction. The scene was one of frantic activity. The base was being rebuilt, rising more imposing than before. Markers and targets were placed along the walls, and new plans for fortifications were being drawn. Upon arrival, Rigger quickly distanced himself, speaking to no one. He approached Polak, who watched him with a mixture of concern and reverence. "Tell everyone I'll be learning Saint Tier healing magic to heal Taze and my arm." "I don't want to be disturbed," Rigger ordered, his voice low but carrying a weight that was not just physical. Polak wanted to say something, wanted to question him, but fear and apprehension silenced him. He simply nodded, understanding that his leader was not himself. Rigger walked toward the main building, his residence, Ghislaine following in silence. When their leader departed, all Polak could do was watch, a strange sense of helplessness consuming him. It was obvious that Rigger was deeply troubled, but why? What had truly happened? Rigger, meanwhile, walked in silence. The pain of losing his arm did not bother him as much as his own thoughts. He felt utterly unworthy. His role as leader seemed empty to him now. How could he be worthy of leading when he was the first to succumb to chaos when faced with difficulty? The massacre he caused, the suffering he inflicted. He no longer knew who he was. Learning Saint Tier healing magic would only be a band-aid, a temporary fix for a much deeper problem. Since Rigger was reborn into this world, he had been confident he would achieve great things with his knowledge. The more he grew, the more he saw the injustices in this world, against his race and many others, and he decided he would change that. His confidence grew with each passing moment, reinforced by those around him. He had ambition, an ambition born and strengthened by everyone around him since birth. They called him strong, talented, and just. He never saw himself as a hero. He never cared for those who were not close to him. He would kill his enemies without hesitation. That was what his instructors had taught him. But they had also taught him leniency and the wisdom to judge who was an enemy and who was not. He could blame all his mistakes on his beastly instincts. But would that bring back the innocent people he had slaughtered? "I thought I would have more control after reaching Saint Tier." The confidence he had built based on his strength and the people who believed in him was gradually beginning to fade. Am I really someone worthy of being followed? How am I supposed to look them in the eyes? How can I give orders again? Will they still follow me out of respect and not out of fear? He pondered as the corridors of the base seemed to stretch endlessly before him. He no longer felt like the leader he once was. He felt smaller than anyone else there. Meanwhile, at the time of teleportation, POV, Rudius Grerat, I was dreaming. In this dream, I was flying through the air, holding Sylphie in my arms. My mind was hazy, but somehow, I knew I was flying. The world around me was nothing more than a blur, with shapes and colors constantly shifting. I soared through the air like a sound wave or a particle of light, my body randomly tossed in different directions. I didn't know why this was happening, but I was certain of one thing: no matter what I tried, I would eventually lose speed and crash into the ground. So I focused. I looked down at the ever-changing landscape, trying to find a relatively safe place to land. Something inside me was screaming that I had to do this, if I wanted to survive. Even so, we were going too fast. And suddenly, we started to slow down. Ah shit. I'm gonna fall. Panic surged in my chest, but now I could see the ground below me clearly. I needed to land in a field. Crashing into the ocean or hitting solid ground directly would be bad. The forests would obviously be dangerous, but if I could aim for a field, I forced myself to land, hoping for the best. Our speed rapidly decreased as we dived toward a vast stretch of yellowish desert land. A moment later, I lost consciousness. When I opened my eyes, I found myself in a completely white, empty space. Some kind of lucid dream? However, for some reason, my body felt strangely heavy. I looked at myself and widened my eyes. I was back in the old familiar form I had for 34 years. Seeing this, memories of my previous life resurfaced. I was still the same bitter, vile, insecure, and selfish trash as ever. The 7 years I spent as Rudius suddenly felt like nothing more than a dream. A crushing wave of disappointment washed over me. I had returned to my old, pathetic body, and I found it disturbingly easy to accept. So it really was just a dream, huh? As far as dreams go, it lasted a ridiculously long time. But in the end, it was all too good to be true. I was born into a loving family and managed to befriend my master Roxy and Sylphie. I guess it was good for 7 years of life. Still, I wanted to enjoy that life a little longer. Ah well. I guess it's over now. As I thought that, my attention drifted. Eventually, I noticed that a strange figure had appeared right in front of me. The individual had a blank face, with nothing on it except a huge, wide grin. I simply couldn't make out any distinguishing features. Whenever I tried to focus on a specific part of their face, it would immediately fade from my memory. My mind refused to form their image. It almost felt like a person was being blurred out by a pixelated mosaic. Still, somehow, I got the impression that I was dealing with someone calm and patient. Hey you. Nice to meet you, Rudius. HM. I had been so busy drowning in self-pity, and now some weird censored guy, like in a porno, was calling out to chat. Actually, that voice was pretty ambiguous. Maybe it was a guy, maybe a girl. Please, let it be a girl. That would make the pixelated thing seem kinda sexy, wouldn't it? Hello? Can you hear me? Ah. Yeah. Sure. Nice to meet you. Excellent. It's good to see you have some manners. I hadn't actually spoken out loud, but it seemed like my new friend here could hear my thoughts. I figured it would be best to keep communicating that way. Wow. Nothing rattles you, does it? That's definitely not true. Ehe. No need to be so modest. Anyway, you are who or what exactly? Can't you figure that out for yourself? I can barely see anything beyond a mosaic. Are you the mighty sperm man or something? The mighty sperm man? Who's that? Does he look like me? Oh, definitely. He's got all his pixels blurred out, just like you. So there's someone like me in your world too? Well, no. Not really. What? Alright, let's move on. I'm a god. The human god, to be specific. Aha. The human god. Sure. I must say, you don't seem very impressed. I'm just wondering why a god would waste time talking to me, I guess. Also, isn't it a little late for you to show up? The god is supposed to appear in the first chapter, don't you think? The first chapter? What do you mean by that? Never mind, it's nothing. Please, continue. Right. Anyway, I've been watching you for some time now. You've been living quite an interesting life. Spying is always fun, isn't it? Oh, absolutely. And that's why I decided to take care of you. You're taking care of me? Wow, thanks. Speaking of superiority, what am I, your pet or something? Come on, no need to be so hostile. I'm only talking to you because I can see you're really in trouble right now. Well, it is a critical situation. Anyone who suddenly shows up offering to solve all your problems while you're struggling is definitely a scammer. No. I'm on your side, buddy. Ha. And now we're buddies? Don't make me laugh. I met guys just like you in my past life, pal. People who showed up and said, do your best, or I'll take care of you. They were all liars. They didn't really care. They just assumed everything would go the way they wanted once they lured me out of my room. No one ever tried to understand the real problem. Everything you're saying reminds me of those people. I'll never trust you. My, that is a problem. Then how about I just give you a piece of advice, huh? Advice? That's right. Feel free to ignore it completely if you want. Right. I get it. So this is your method. I know this one too. People loved giving me advice. They thought they could shove a bunch of self-help into me and make me focus on something other than my own misery. Give me a break. Just get to the point. What good is a positive thought going to do for me now? I've already passed the point where my emotional state makes any difference. Being optimistic will only lead to more pain in the future. I mean, this is exactly the case in question. Why the hell did you let me dream? Alternate reality, my ass. I clung to the second chance at life, and then you come along and pull the rug out from under me? Did you really have to be such a damn sadist? Wait a minute. I think you don't understand what's happening. I want to help you with your current life, not your previous one. HM. Then why am I like this? This is your astral form. It's different from your current body. My astral form? That's right. Your body is perfectly fine. So, this is just a dream? When I wake up, I won't be stuck in this horrible body. That's right. Since you're dreaming now, you'll go back to normal as soon as you wake up. Better now. Wow. All right. So this is just some weird dream. Well, it's not just a dream. I'm speaking directly into your mind. It's hard to believe that your mental image would be so different from your real body. Telepathy, huh? Fine, whatever. But what do you actually want from me? Do you plan on sending me back to my old world? Since I don't belong here or something like that. Don't be ridiculous. I couldn't send you anywhere other than the hexafacial world, obviously. Humph. Maybe that's obvious to you, but I'm in the dark here. A very reasonable point. Wait a minute. If you can't send me back, then you're not the one who reincarnated me into this world, are you? Exactly. Anyway, reincarnation isn't my department. That's the specialty of a certain nasty dragon god. HRM. So there's even an evil dragon involved, huh? Anyway, do you want to hear my advice or not? No thanks. Huh. Why not? You really give off the impression of a con artist. And that's really a good reason to ignore me? At this rate, you'll end up dead. I will? Why? The Begarit continent is a very dangerous place. For one, there's not much to eat. On the other hand, it's full of monsters and labyrinths, especially compared to the central continent. You don't know their language, and nothing will be like what you expected from your old home. Are you really confident you can survive? The Begarit continent? What? Hold on a second. You mean the desert on the other side of the world? Why would I be there? You were caught in a massive magical disaster. You ended up being teleported. A magical disaster? Are you talking about that light? That's right. So that was some kind of teleportation spell. Wait. I wasn't the only one hit by that thing. The people from Buena Village were teleported too. Do you know anything about that, buddy? Would you really believe my answer? You don't even want to hear my advice. Good point. You'd probably just lie and laugh about it. All I'll say is that they're all praying for your safety. Everyone wants you to return alive. Well, yeah. Of course they do. Did you really believe that? Isn't there a part of you that thinks they might have been relieved to be rid of you? Yeah. I'd be lying if I said that thought hadn't crossed my mind. At the end of my old life, no one cared whether I lived or died. I still have some self-esteem issues because of that. Well, people in this world care about you. It's better if you come back in one piece. All right. You're right. I won't give you any guarantees, but I think you have a good chance of making it back alive if you follow my advice. Wait. Before that, I want to know why you're doing this. Why are you so concerned about me? Hey, you're persistent. I just think things will be more entertaining if you stay alive. Got it? Isn't that enough? People who only care about their own amusement tend to be scumbags, you should know. Is that how it was in your past life? All the time. I met some guys like that, and they all loved making others dance like puppets just for fun. HM. Well, I like doing that from time to time too. I won't deny it. And what's so fun about watching me? You're just interesting, that's all. I almost never get to see what someone from a completely different world is doing. Great. So, I'm a pet monkey, and you want to teach me some new tricks. Is that it? Sigh. Look. You haven't forgotten my question, have you? What question? Then I'll repeat it. Are you sure you can survive? Stuck in a dangerous and unfamiliar land? No, not really. Then maybe you should listen to me. Like I said, it's up to you whether you follow my suggestions or not. All right. Fine. I get it. Go ahead. Give me your advice if that's what you want. What was the whole point of this pompous conversation, anyway? You could have just told me what I need to do from the start and saved me the headache. Okay. Now listen carefully, young Rudius. Right after you wake up, you'll see a scorching desert. Make it rain as hard as you can and build a house out of earth. As those last fleeting words echoed into the void, the blurred god disappeared completely.
And that concludes this episode. If you enjoyed it, I'd seriously love it if you guys could leave a like on the video, as it genuinely helps out so much, and it keeps me going, plus it takes only 1 second. That said, have a wonderful day. See you in the next one.